The rain had turned Chicago into a canvas of muted grays and relentless motion. Lightning illuminated the towering skyscrapers in brief, stark flashes as thunder rolled across the city like an ominous drumbeat. Charles Green sat behind the wheel of his Bentley, fingers drumming against the leather steering wheel with practiced impatience. Through the rain-streaked windshield, the city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of neon and shadow. His mind should have been on the board meeting ahead, quarterly projections, merger proposals, the usual symphony of numbers and strategies that had built his empire. Instead, his attention kept drifting to a figure huddled beneath a broken awning, a young woman, barely visible through the downpour, clutching something precious to her chest. The traffic light turned red, forcing him to stop. Charles's gaze fixed on the woman's desperate attempt to shield what he now realized was a child from the bitter wind and rain. Her thin jacket offered little protection, and even from this distance he could see her shivering. The child let out a cry that seemed to pierce through the storm's cacophony, stirring something deep within him, a memory he'd spent decades trying to forget. "Not your problem," he muttered, a mantra that had served him well throughout his ascent from poverty to power. The light turned green. Behind him, horns blared with increasing urgency. But Charles remained frozen, watching as the woman pressed her lips to the child's forehead in a gesture of such tender desperation that it made his chest ache. The child's next cry was weaker, worryingly so. Charles recognized the sound, the same whimper he'd heard 30 years ago, when his own sister. Before he could second-guess himself, Charles pulled over. The woman startled as his passenger window descended, rain immediately spattering the leather interior. Up close, he could see the fever flush on the child's cheeks, the mother's eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. "Get in," he said, his voice clipped but steady. When she hesitated, clutching the child closer, he added more softly, "Your baby needs help." Why, the woman's voice was hoarse, barely audible above the storm. "Why would you help us?" Charles hesitated. How could he explain what he barely understood himself? The ghost of a memory, a different stormy night, a different child, a help that came too late pressed against his consciousness. Because he said finally, "Some nights we all need someone to stop." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze moving from his expensive suit to his carefully neutral expression. Then the child whimpered again, and he saw the decision form in the slight sag of her shoulders. She opened the back door, carefully sliding in with practiced movements that spoke of a mother's instinct to protect. "I'm Charles Green," he said, pulling away from the curb. "And you are?" "Natalie," she replied quietly, still cradling the child. "And this is Pamela. She's burning up. I've been trying to find a clinic that would..." She trailed off, the weight of unspoken struggles hanging in the air between them. As they drove through the rain-slicked streets toward his mansion, Charles caught glimpses of them in his rearview mirror. Natalie's tender attention to her daughter struck a chord in him that he thought had long since gone silent. This wasn't charity, he realized. This was redemption. What he couldn't know, was that this rain-soaked encounter would unravel carefully constructed facades and expose long-buried secrets. That the woman in his backseat was more than just a desperate mother, and that her presence in his life would trigger a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of Chicago's most powerful family. For now, though, there was only the rain, the quiet hum of the engine, and three souls bound together by a moment of humanity in the storm. The Whitmore Tower pierced the Chicago skyline like a modern-day castle, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun in brilliant shards of light. And from his corner office on the 92nd floor, Charles Green surveyed the city below a landscape he had helped shape over 2 decades of calculated decisions and strategic acquisitions. The morning paper lay open on his mahogany desk, the headline catching the light: "Whitmore Enterprises expands healthcare division." Albert Whitmore's signature was barely dry on the morning's contracts, yet Charles could already feel the ripples of change spreading through Chicago's business community. The acquisition of 3 major hospitals would reshape the city's healthcare landscape, though not everyone shared their vision. The board meeting that morning had been particularly contentious, with several members expressing concerns about the aggressive expansion. Mr. Green, his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "MS Rachel Whitmore is here to see you." Charles straightened his tie, a habit born from years of boardroom battles. "Send her in." Rachel Whitmore entered with the precise grace of someone who had grown up in the spotlight. Her tailored suit and perfectly styled hair projected the image expected of Albert Whitmore's daughter and heir apparent. But Charles noticed the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped her tablet just a fraction too tightly. "The Morrison Group is pushing back," she said without preamble, placing a document on his desk. "They're claiming the acquisition violates antitrust regulations." Charles skimmed the document, his expression remaining carefully neutral. "They've been looking for leverage since we outbid them on the St. Mary's contract." "This is different," Rachel's voice carried an edge of concern. "They're bringing up father's history with the medical board, suggesting there might be personal motivations behind our healthcare expansion." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Albert Whitmore's past held secrets that could destroy more than just business deals, though only a handful of people knew the full truth. Charles was one of them, having earned Albert's trust through years of unwavering loyalty and demonstrated discretion. "Handle the legal team," Charles instructed, rising to stand by the window. "I'll speak with your father about containing any potential fallout." Rachel hesitated, an unusual display of uncertainty from someone known for her decisive nature. "There's something else. The board is questioning your recent charitable initiatives." Charles knew she was referring to the new community health programs he'd implemented, including free clinics in underserved neighborhoods. Programs that some board members saw as unnecessary drains on company resources. "The clinics are profitable," he stated flatly. "It's not about profit margins." Rachel moved to stand beside him, her reflection joining his in the window glass. "There are whispers that you're getting soft, Charles, that your focus is shifting away from what built this company." The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. What had built Whitmore Enterprises was Albert Whitmore's ruthless business acumen, combined with a carefully maintained public image of corporate responsibility. It was a delicate balance that had made them billions and cost them pieces of their souls along the way. "Your father understands the importance of public perception," Charles reminded her. "These initiatives generate goodwill, which translates to shareholder value." Rachel turned to face him, her green eyes so like her father's searching his face. "Is that really all this is about? Shareholder value?" Before Charles could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from security. There was a situation in the lobby, a woman causing a scene, demanding to speak with someone from leadership about patient care practices at one of their newly acquired hospitals. "Have security handle it," Rachel suggested, already turning to leave. But something made Charles check the security feed on his computer. The image was grainy, but he could make out a woman in a worn coat, her professional demeanor at odds with her desperate expression. She was clutching a medical file and arguing with the security guards, her passion evident even through the silent footage. "I'll deal with this personally," he said, reaching for his suit jacket. Rachel's eyebrows rose. "Since when does the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises handle lobby security issues?" "Since we're about to own 3 more hospitals," Charles replied smoothly. "Every interaction matters now." As he rode the elevator down, Charles reflected on how much had changed in the 20 years since he'd joined Whitmore Enterprises. He'd started as a junior analyst, hungry and determined to escape his humble beginnings. Albert had recognized something in him, perhaps a reflection of his own driving ambition, and had mentored him, groomed him for leadership. Now, as CEO, Charles had more power than he'd ever dreamed of as a child. Yet lately, he'd found himself questioning the costs of that power, wondering if success measured in dollars and market share was success at all. The elevator doors opened to reveal chaos in the lobby. The woman from the security feed was now surrounded by 3 guards, her voice carrying clearly across the marble expanse, "People are dying because of your policies. Does anyone here even care?" As Charles approached, he caught sight of her face and felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. She was older than in the security feed, her clothes more worn, but he recognized her immediately. Dr. Sarah Martinez, formerly one of Chicago's most promising young surgeons before a controversial case had ended her career. "Dr. Martinez," he called out, causing all heads to turn, "I believe you wanted to speak with leadership. Shall we discuss this in my office?" The security guards stepped back, confusion evident on their faces. Dr. Martinez stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate hope in her expression. "You know who I am." "I make it my business to know about all significant events in Chicago's medical community," Charles replied carefully, "including those that perhaps deserve a second look." As he led her to the private elevator, Charles could feel Rachel's gaze following them from across the lobby. He knew there would be questions later, demands for explanations about why the CEO was personally entertaining the complaints of a disgraced doctor. But something about Dr. Martinez's presence felt significant, a harbinger of change, though whether for good or ill, he couldn't yet say. What he did know was that the carefully constructed world of Whitmore Enterprises was about to face challenges that no amount of corporate strategy could prepare them for. The elevator doors closed, sealing them in pristine silence. Dr. Martinez clutched her medical file like a shield, her knuckles white with tension. Charles straightened his tie once more, a general preparing for an unexpected battle. "Now then, Doctor," he said quietly, "tell me what's really bringing you to our door." The photograph sat in Natalie's worn leather wallet, creased at the corners, but still clear, a younger version of herself in a white coat, standing proudly outside Chicago General's pediatric ward. She traced the edge of the image with trembling fingers as she sat in Charles's opulent guest room, Pamela sleeping peacefully nearby. 5 years ago, she had been Dr. Natalie Foster, rising star of pediatric medicine, known for her innovative treatment approaches and exceptional patient care. The children had loved her gentle manner, the way she could explain complex procedures through simple stories. Parents had requested her by name, confident in both her expertise and her compassion. Then Christopher Williams had entered her life. He'd seemed perfect at first, charming, successful, understanding of her demanding schedule. As the hospital's new administrator, he'd praised her work publicly, championing her methods to the board. Their whirlwind romance had been the talk of the hospital. "You'll revolutionize pediatric care," he'd told her, his smile warm and convincing. "We'll do it together." She hadn't seen the manipulation beneath his support, hadn't recognized how he was isolating her from colleagues, subtly undermining her confidence while presenting himself as her only ally. By the time she discovered the truth about his embezzlement scheme, it was too late. The anonymous complaint about her treatment protocols had come first, followed by accusations of prescription impropriety. Christopher had offered to help by altering records, then used those alterations to destroy her credibility when she threatened to expose his crimes. Her medical license had been suspended pending investigation. The hospital board, led by Christopher's carefully cultivated allies, had accepted his version of events. Overnight, she'd gone from respected physician to suspected fraud. When she'd discovered her pregnancy a month later, Christopher had already disappeared with millions in hospital funds, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Across town, in his penthouse office, Charles Green was facing his own demons. The morning's encounter with Dr. Martinez had stirred memories he'd rather forget. His fingers traced the small scar above his right eyebrow, a souvenir from his father's signet ring, from the night he'd tried to stop one of the drunken rages. His sister Emily had been sick that winter. Their father, already drowning in gambling debts, had refused to take her to a doctor. By the time their mother had finally managed to scrape together enough money for the clinic, it had been too late. Charles had sworn then, at 14, that he would never be powerless again. He'd worked his way through school, taking any job he could find, studying through exhaustion until his grades earned him a scholarship. Each success had been a step further from the boy who couldn't save his sister. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now controlled the very hospitals that might have saved Emily. His recent push for expanded children's healthcare services wasn't just about public relations, though few knew the true motivation behind his dedication to the cause. Rachel Whitmore stood in her father's study, staring at the family photographs that lined the walls. There she was at various ages, graduating prep school, receiving her MBA, taking her place on the company board. Picture-perfect moments that told nothing of the lonely dinners and missed birthdays of a father more comfortable with spreadsheets than emotional conversations. Her mother's absence was conspicuous in the later photos. Caroline Whitmore had left when Rachel was 12, unable to bear Albert's obsession with the company and his mysterious melancholy. Rachel had chosen to stay with her father, determined to understand what could make a man build an empire while letting his personal life crumble. Still studying the gallery, Albert's voice made her turn. He stood in the doorway, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him. "Just thinking," Rachel replied, noting how his eyes skipped over certain photos as they always did. "The Morrison Group's threats have me wondering about our history." Albert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The past should stay in the past, Rachel." "Should it?" She moved to the window, watching the city lights emerge as dusk fell. "I've been CEO in training since I could walk, Father. I know every contract, every acquisition, every strategy that built this company. But lately I feel like I'm missing crucial pieces of the story." "Business is about looking forward, not back," Albert said, but his voice lacked conviction. Rachel turned to face him. "The Morrison Group seems very interested in your history with the medical board. In fact, they specifically mentioned events from 25 years ago." The color drained from Albert's face. For a moment he looked ancient, weighted down by secrets. Then his mask slipped back into place, the transformation so practiced she almost doubted what she'd seen. "Handle the Morrison Group through legal channels," he instructed. "And Rachel? Some questions are better left unasked." But Rachel had spent her life studying her father, learning to read the microscopic shifts in his expression. Something about the Morrison Group's threats had shaken him deeply, and she intended to find out why. Later that evening, as Natalie bathed a finally fever-free Pamela in the mansion's luxurious guest bathroom, her mind wandered to her mother. Helen Foster had raised her alone, working double shifts as a nurse to provide opportunities she'd never had herself. She'd never spoken of Natalie's father, deflecting questions with practiced skill. "Some stories are too complicated for simple answers," Helen would say, her eyes distant. "What matters is love, and you've always had that in abundance." Looking at Pamela's innocent face, Natalie understood her mother's protective instincts better now. She would do anything to shield her daughter from pain, to give her the security she deserved. The irony of their current situation, accepting help from one of Chicago's wealthiest men, would have made Helen laugh. She'd always taught Natalie to be self-sufficient, to stand on her own feet. But she'd also taught her that true strength sometimes meant accepting help when it was offered with a genuine heart. "Your grandfather was a proud man," Helen had told her once, near the end. "Too proud to accept help when it was offered. Don't make his mistakes, sweetheart. Don't let pride stand in the way of love." As the city settled into night, these four souls, each carrying their own burdens of past wounds and present fears, moved like planets in increasingly convergent orbits. None of them could know how their individual stories were already intertwined, or how the truth, when it finally emerged, would transform them all. The morning sun filtered through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors as Mrs. Sullivan, the housekeeper of 30 years, observed the newcomers with carefully concealed curiosity. She'd served the Whitmore family long enough to recognize when change was coming, and these guests, the young mother and her child, represented something significant. The East Wing guest suite needs fresh linens, Charles instructed, his tone carrying that odd gentleness she'd never heard before. And have the kitchen prepare something suitable for a child with fever. Of course, Mr. Green. Mrs. Sullivan watched as Natalie carried Pamela up the grand staircase, noting how the young woman's worn shoes and careful movements contrasted sharply with the opulence surrounding her. "Shall I call Dr. Harrison?" "That won't be necessary." Charles's response was too quick. "Our guest has medical training. She'll know what Pamela needs." Mrs. Sullivan had survived decades in service to the wealthy by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, but she'd also learned to read the subtle currents of power and emotion that flowed through great houses like this one. Something about Charles's protective stance, the way his eyes followed Natalie's progress up the stairs, suggested complications to come. Her concerns proved prescient when Rachel Whitmore arrived unannounced that afternoon. Rachel's Louboutin heels clicked against the marble with military precision as she strode through the foyer, her expression darkening at the sight of children's medicine and a stuffed bear on the usually immaculate side table. Charles, her voice carried that particular tone of controlled displeasure that Mrs. Sullivan had heard so often from Albert Whitmore. "I thought we were meeting to discuss the Morrison situation." Charles emerged from his study, his usual impeccable appearance slightly rumpled, as if he'd been running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Rachel, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Clearly, Rachel's gaze swept the evidence of domestic disruption. "You have guests." Before Charles could respond, Pamela's laughter echoed down the staircase, bright, uninhibited joy that seemed to transform the austere space. Rachel's eyebrows rose as Natalie appeared at the top of the stairs, carrying a much-improved Pamela. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Rachel said, her tone carrying that particular blend of courtesy and challenge that only the very wealthy could perfect. "I'm Rachel Whitmore." Natalie Foster. The response was quiet but steady, matched by an unwavering gaze that seemed to surprise Rachel. "And this is Pamela." Something flickered across Rachel's face, recognition perhaps, though she quickly masked it. "Foster! That name sounds familiar." "Dr. Foster," Charles interjected smoothly, climbing the stairs to join them. "She's consulting on our new pediatric initiatives." The lie hung in the air, elegant but fragile. Mrs. Sullivan busied herself with adjusting a flower arrangement, ears attuned to the delicate dance of power and pretense playing out above her. How interesting. Rachel's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I wasn't aware we were bringing in external consultants for that project." "Recent development," Charles replied. His hand moved unconsciously to rest on the banister near Natalie, a subtle but clear gesture of support that didn't escape Rachel's notice. "We should discuss this in private," Rachel suggested, though her tone made it more of a command. "Along with the Morrison situation." As Charles led Rachel to his study, Mrs. Sullivan approached Natalie with a warmth that surprised even herself. "The kitchen has prepared chicken soup, miss. Good for both fever and spirits. My mother always said." Natalie's grateful smile was genuine, though her eyes kept darting to the closed study door. "Thank you. Everyone has been very kind." "Mr. Green is a good man," Mrs. Sullivan found herself saying, "though he tries hard to hide it sometimes." Meanwhile, in the study, Rachel wasted no time on pleasantries. "What are you doing, Charles?" "Helping someone in need." He moved to the window, a habit when he felt defensive. "Something your father taught me the value of, if you recall." "Don't." Rachel's voice cracked slightly. "Don't use father's philosophies to justify whatever this is. I did some checking after you left the office. Dr. Natalie Foster's medical license was suspended 2 years ago. She was accused of falsifying records, Charles." Charles turned to face her, his expression hardening. "Accusations aren't facts, Rachel. You of all people should understand how easily reputations can be destroyed by strategic lies." The reference to her mother's tabloid scandal made Rachel flinch. That was different. Was it? Charles stepped closer, his voice lowering. Your father taught me another valuable lesson. Look deeper than the surface story. I think Dr. Foster deserves that courtesy at least. The board won't see it that way. Rachel's concern was genuine now. With the Morrison Group already circling, we can't afford any hint of scandal. As if on cue, Albert Whitmore's voice carried from the foyer. He'd arrived unannounced as well. Mrs. Sullivan watched as he stopped abruptly at the sight of Natalie and Pamela, still near the stairs. The blood drained from his face so quickly that she feared he might faint. Father, Rachel emerged from the study, confused by his reaction. Are you all right? Albert couldn't seem to take his eyes off Natalie, who shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze. There was something in his expression, recognition, guilt, fear that made Mrs. Sullivan's breath catch. Helen, he whispered, so quietly that only Mrs. Sullivan, standing nearest to him, could hear. My God, she looks just like Helen. The pieces began falling into place in Mrs. Sullivan's mind, memories of a young nurse who'd occasionally visited the mansion late at night, decades ago when Albert's wife was away. The timing, the resemblance, the reaction. She glanced at Rachel, wondering if she'd made the connection yet. Charles broke the tense moment, stepping forward to make introductions. But Mrs. Sullivan could see that something fundamental had shifted in the mansion's carefully maintained balance of power and secrets. The arrival of Natalie and Pamela hadn't just disrupted the physical space, it had cracked the foundation of decades of carefully maintained illusions. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows through the mansion's windows, 4 generations of choices, secrets, and consequences began their inevitable collision course. Mrs. Sullivan said a quiet prayer for them all. In her 30 years of service, she'd learned that the truth, once it started emerging, was like water. It would find every crack, every weakness, until the whole structure either transformed or crumbled. The question was, which would happen here? The morning headlines of the Chicago Tribune cast an unwelcome spotlight on Whitmore Enterprises' healthcare giant faces scrutiny over hospital acquisitions. Charles Green stood at his office window, the newspaper forgotten on his desk, as he watched the city wake below. The board meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock loomed like a gathering storm. His phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. Morrison Group leaked documents to the press. Father wants to speak with you privately before the meeting. The past 24 hours had transformed his carefully ordered world. The presence of Natalie and Pamela in his home had already stirred questions among board members, and now, with the Morrison Group's aggressive moves, the timing couldn't be worse. Albert's office occupied the top floor of Whitmore Tower, a space designed to intimidate with its sweeping views and minimalist grandeur. When Charles entered, he found his mentor standing at the window, shoulders rigid with tension. The Morrison Group Albert began without turning has obtained records from 25 years ago. Medical board records that were supposed to be sealed. Charles remained silent, waiting. He'd learned long ago that Albert Whitmore's pauses often held more significance than his words. They're threatening to expose everything. Albert continued, his reflection in the glass showing every year of his age. Not just the old hospital scandal, but personal matters as well. The nurse Charles said quietly, Helen Foster. Albert turned sharply. How did you? I saw your reaction to Natalie yesterday. The resemblance is remarkable. Does Rachel know? Not yet. But she's suspicious. Your daughter has your instinct for sensing weakness. Albert sank into his chair, suddenly looking vulnerable in a way that unsettled Charles. I loved Helen, he said quietly. It wasn't just an affair. I wanted to marry her, to acknowledge Natalie, but the timing. The hospital merger Charles finished, the one that built this empire. The board would never have approved if they'd known about Helen. The scandal would have destroyed everything I'd built. Albert's hands clenched on his armrests. I thought I was protecting everyone by keeping quiet. Helen agreed it was best for Natalie. The intercom buzzed, announcing the arrival of the board members. Albert straightened, his mask of corporate authority sliding back into place. "Handle the meeting, Charles. Whatever it takes." The boardroom felt like a courtroom as Charles presented the quarterly figures. 20 pairs of eyes watched him with varying degrees of skepticism as he outlined the benefits of their healthcare expansion. "These acquisitions position us perfectly in the growing medical services market," he concluded, his voice steady despite the tension headache building behind his eyes. Marcus Reynolds, the longest-serving board member, cleared his throat. "And what about the rumors concerning Dr. Foster's presence at your residence, Mr. Green? The board has concerns about your judgment in this matter." "Dr. Foster is consulting on our pediatric care initiatives," Charles replied smoothly, repeating the lie that was becoming more complicated by the hour. "Her insights are valuable to our expansion plans." "Her medical license was suspended," Reynolds countered. "Surely you're aware of the potential liability." The boardroom doors opened, interrupting Reynolds mid-sentence. Dr. Sarah Martinez strode in, her presence causing a ripple of murmurs around the table. "My apologies for the interruption," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "But since you're discussing Dr. Foster's case, I thought you should hear the truth." Charles fought to keep his expression neutral, though his heart raced. He hadn't expected Martinez to make her move so soon. "This is a private meeting," Reynolds began, but Martinez cut him off. 2 years ago, Christopher Williams orchestrated a systematic fraud at Chicago General. He destroyed Dr. Foster's career to cover his tracks. I have proof." She placed a USB drive on the table. "Everything is here, the original records, Williams's alterations, the money trail. I've spent 2 years gathering evidence, and I'm ready to testify before the medical board." The boardroom erupted in hushed conversations. Charles caught Rachel's eye across the table. She looked shaken, but he could see her mind working, calculating the implications. "If this evidence is legitimate," Rachel said, rising to her feet, "it changes everything. Not just for Dr. Foster, but for our healthcare division's credibility. And if it's not," Reynolds challenged, "if we back the wrong horse in this race, the Morrison Group will use it to block every acquisition we have planned." Charles stood, commanding attention with his presence rather than his voice. "Dr. Foster's case represents exactly what our healthcare initiative stands for: integrity in medical care, justice for those wronged by corrupt administrators, and most importantly, putting patient care above profit." He turned to face each board member in turn. "The Morrison Group isn't threatening us because they're concerned about competition. They're afraid we'll expose the same kind of corruption in their own operations. Supporting Dr. Foster isn't just right, it's smart business." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Charles could see the shift in their expressions from skepticism to consideration, from concern to calculation. "I move we review Dr. Martinez's evidence," Rachel said finally. "And if it confirms her claims, we proceed with a full public statement supporting Dr. Foster's reinstatement." The vote was unanimous. As the board members filed out, Rachel lingered behind. "That was quite a performance," she said quietly. "But you're playing a dangerous game, Charles. If there's more to this story, anything you're not telling us now would be the time." Charles thought of Natalie and Pamela, of Albert's confession, of the web of connections still hidden beneath the surface. "Trust me, Rachel, some games are worth the risk." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, we could lose everything." As Charles rode the elevator back to his office, his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Sullivan, MS. Natalie saw the newspaper headlines. "She's planning to leave." The carefully constructed plans began to crumble. Charles pressed the lobby button, knowing he had to stop her before she disappeared. The truth was finally starting to emerge, but if Natalie left now, they might lose their only chance to make things right. Rachel Whitmore sat in her private office, surrounded by dossiers and digital records that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The private investigator's preliminary report on Natalie Foster lay open on her tablet, its contents forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about her family. Medical records, newspaper clippings, and employment histories created a timeline that couldn't be ignored. Helen Foster had worked at Chicago General during the exact period her father had served on the medical board. The dates aligned perfectly with the gap in her father's personal photographs, the year her mother had spent at their lake house recovering from exhaustion. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, quickly minimizing the screens. Charles entered, his expression grave. "Natalie's planning to leave." Good Rachel responded automatically, then paused at his sharp look. "Isn't that what's best for everyone?" "Is it?" He settled into the chair across from her desk. "Or is it just easier than facing the truth?" Rachel's fingers tightened on her pen. "I've been doing some research, Charles. Things aren't adding up. The timing of Father's involvement with Chicago General, Helen Foster's sudden departure from the hospital, the sealed records the Morrison Group is threatening to expose. What are you suggesting?" "I think you already know." She turned her tablet around, showing him a photograph from an old hospital fundraiser. In it, Albert Whitmore stood next to a beautiful young nurse, their body language speaking volumes despite their professional distance. "That's Helen Foster, isn't it? Natalie's mother." Charles remained silent, his expression unreadable. "My mother left when I was 12, Rachel continued, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "She said she couldn't compete with Father's secrets anymore. I never understood what she meant until now." In the mansion's guest suite, Natalie was carefully packing the few belongings they'd accumulated during their brief stay. Pamela played contentedly with the stuffed bear Charles had given her, unaware of her mother's inner turmoil. The newspaper headlines had confirmed her worst fears. Her presence here would only complicate an already volatile situation. The Whitmore empire was under scrutiny, and she refused to be the match that ignited the powder keg. "MS. Natalie," Mrs. Sullivan's gentle voice came from the doorway. "Perhaps you'd like some tea before you go." Natalie smiled sadly at the kind housekeeper. "Thank you, but we should leave before." Before what? Albert Whitmore himself stood in the hallway, looking older and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him in newspaper photographs. Before the truth comes out. Natalie instinctively moved to stand between him and Pamela. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't want to cause any trouble." "You look so much like her," he said softly, taking a step forward. "I knew it the moment I saw you, but I was too much of a coward to acknowledge it." "Please don't," Natalie's voice cracked. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're about to say." "I loved your mother," Albert continued, his words rushing out as if he'd held them back for too long. "I wanted to marry her, to give you both the life you deserved. But the timing, the hospital merger, everything was so precarious." Natalie felt the room spin slightly. "What are you saying?" "He's saying he's your father," Rachel's voice came from behind Albert, sharp with barely contained emotion. "Aren't you, father?" The silence that followed was deafening. Pamela's innocent babbling seemed to echo off the walls as four adults stood frozen in a tableau of long-buried truths finally surfacing. "I found Mum's old letters," Rachel continued, stepping into the room. "The ones she wrote but never sent, about the real reason she left. She knew about Helen, about the baby, about you, Natalie." Natalie sank onto the bed, her legs no longer able to support her. 25 years of questions about her father, of her mother's careful deflections and sad smiles, suddenly took on new meaning. "Mother never told me," she whispered. "She never said a word." "Helen was protecting you," Albert said, his voice thick with regret. "Protecting all of us, really. She knew a scandal would destroy everything, the merger, the foundation we were building. She agreed to leave, to let me provide for you both quietly." Provide? Rachel's laugh was bitter, Is that what you call abandoning your child? Creating shell companies to funnel money to them while pretending they don't exist?" Rachel Charles warned softly, appearing in the doorway. "No, she deserves to know," Rachel continued, turning to Natalie. "Our father has been watching you your entire life from a distance. He has photos, report cards, newspaper clippings about your medical career. He even attended your medical school graduation, sat in the back, left before the ceremony ended." Natalie looked at Albert, seeing him truly for the first time. The proud businessman's facade had crumbled, leaving behind a man weighted down by decades of regret. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. "I told myself that financial security was more important than being there. I was wrong. When I heard about what happened with Christopher Williams, what he did to your career, I wanted to step in. But I was still a coward." "Stop," Natalie said firmly, rising to her feet. She picked up Pamela, holding her close like a shield. "Whatever your reasons were, whatever justifications you had there in the past, I'm not that little girl anymore. I'm a mother now, and I understand something my mother tried to teach me. Love isn't about providing from a distance. It's about being present, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you something." Rachel's expression softened slightly as she watched Natalie with Pamela. "She's right, Father. You taught me everything about business, about power and success. But you never taught me about family because you didn't know yourself." Albert stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward Natalie, then dropping helplessly to his side. Can we try to be a family? All of us." The Morrison Group's press conference had turned the quiet tension into a public spectacle. Television screens throughout Chicago broadcast live coverage of James Morrison himself, standing before a forest of microphones on the steps of their corporate headquarters. The recent acquisitions by Whitmore Enterprises raise serious ethical concerns, Morrison declared, his practiced voice carrying authority. "Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of questionable decisions dating back decades, involving both the medical board and hospital administration." In the Whitmore Towers executive lounge, Rachel watched the broadcast with growing concern. The implications were clear. This wasn't just about business competition anymore. The Morrison Group was preparing to expose everything. "He's baiting us," Charles observed, his reflection in the window overlapping with the city skyline, "trying to force our hand before we're ready." "The board is already nervous," Rachel replied, her fingers drumming against her coffee cup. "Reynolds called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. They're questioning every decision, every appointment, especially your support of Dr. Foster." The mention of Natalie's professional title felt significant. Since the revelation of her true parentage, the lines between personal and professional had become hopelessly blurred. At Chicago General Hospital, Dr. Sarah Martinez faced her own interrogation. The medical board had convened a special hearing to review her evidence about Christopher Williams's fraud. "Your allegations are serious, Dr. Anderson," the board chairman stated. "Accusing a former hospital administrator of systematic fraud could have far-reaching consequences." "The consequences already exist," Martinez countered, her voice steady. "An innocent doctor lost her career. Patients lost a physician who genuinely cared for them. The real fraud is allowing this injustice to continue." The hearing room was packed with hospital staff, many of whom had worked with Natalie. Their presence felt like a silent testimony to her character, a counterweight to the official narrative that had destroyed her reputation. Back at the mansion, Natalie sat in the garden with Pamela, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the chaos swirling around them. Mrs. Sullivan brought them lunch, her kind presence a reminder that not everyone viewed their situation through the lens of scandal. "The media is calling," Mrs. Sullivan reported quietly. "Mr. Green has instructed security not to let any reporters past the gate." Natalie nodded, watching Pamela chase butterflies through the manicured flower beds. "How long can we hide here? The truth is going to come out, one way or another." "Perhaps that's not such a bad thing," Mrs. Sullivan suggested. Secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. The wisdom in those words was interrupted by Albert's arrival. He stood awkwardly at the garden's edge, still uncertain of his place in this new family dynamic. The Morrison group, he began, then stopped, watching Pamela play. They're threatening to expose everything, not just about Helen and me, but about Christopher Williams as well. They've somehow connected all the dots. How, Natalie asked, her professional training making her focus on the practical aspects. The records were sealed. Money opens many doors, Albert replied bitterly. James Morrison's father and I were rivals decades ago. He's been waiting for an opportunity like this. A different kind of tension filled the corporate offices of the Chicago Tribune. Editor-in-Chief Margaret Chen reviewed the stack of documents that had appeared on her desk that morning: medical board records, financial transactions, personal correspondence. It's all verifiable, her investigative reporter confirmed. The Morrison Group's allegations about Whitmore's past aren't just speculation. They have proof. Chen studied a photograph of young Natalie Foster receiving her medical school diploma. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, stood Albert Whitmore. This isn't just about corporate rivalry, she mused. This is about family, about choices made decades ago. The question is, what's the real story here? The answer came from an unexpected source. That evening, as the city's lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, Rachel Whitmore walked into the Tribune's offices unannounced. I want to tell you the truth, she said to Chen. All of it. About my father, about Natalie, about what really happened at Chicago General. But I have conditions. Chen leaned forward, intrigued. I'm listening. The story can't be about scandal or revenge, Rachel stated firmly. It needs to be about healing, about family, about righting past wrongs. And most importantly, it needs to help clear Dr. Foster's name. As Rachel shared the full story, carefully constructed narratives began to crumble. The truth, she realized, wasn't just about exposing past mistakes, it was about creating a path forward, about turning private pain into public redemption. Across town, Charles sat in his office, reviewing the statement he'd prepared for the board. The words felt inadequate in the face of such complex emotions and tangled histories. His phone buzzed with a message from Natalie: I won't hide anymore. For Pamela's sake, for all our sakes, the truth needs to come out, whatever the consequences. Charles smiled slightly, recognizing the strength that had first drawn him to her that rainy night. Some battles weren't about winning or losing, but about choosing the right side of history. The sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows through the city's gleaming towers. In boardrooms and newsrooms, in gardens and offices, the pieces were falling into place for a confrontation that would reshape not just a corporate empire, but the lives of everyone involved. Tomorrow would bring headlines and revelations, accusations and defenses. But tonight, in the quiet of the mansion's garden, Natalie watched her daughter play, finally understanding that some secrets were too heavy to carry alone, and that true strength lay not in maintaining facades, but in having the courage to let them fall. Dawn painted the Chicago skyline in soft pastels as Charles found Natalie in the mansion's library, curled in a window seat with a medical journal. The morning light cast a gentle glow over her features, reminding him of that first rainy night that seemed so long ago now. You're up early, he observed, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing the peaceful atmosphere. Old habits, Natalie replied, closing the journal. Hospital rotations train me to function at dawn. Besides, Pamela sleeps better here than she has in months. Charles settled into a nearby armchair, noting how Natalie seemed more at ease in the mansion's grandeur than she had initially. Dr. Martinez called. The medical board is reviewing your case formally. They've already found irregularities in the original investigation. A flicker of hope crossed Natalie's face, quickly tempered by caution. Christopher had powerful friends on the board. So do you now, Charles leaned forward, his expression earnest. The Whitmore name may be complicated, but it still carries weight. Albert is prepared to testify about what he knew of Christopher's activities. Natalie's fingers traced the journal's spine, a gesture Charles had come to recognize as her processing difficult emotions. "It's strange," she said finally. "A month ago I was alone, fighting a battle I couldn't win. Now I have a father, a sister, and—" She paused, meeting his gaze. "Whatever this is." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Before Charles could respond, Pamela's voice echoed down the hallway, followed by Rachel's laughter, a sound that had become surprisingly common in recent days. They found them in the breakfast room, where Rachel was attempting to negotiate with a syrup-covered Pamela about the proper way to eat pancakes. The scene was so domestic, so far removed from Rachel's usual corporate efficiency, that Charles had to smile. "She insisted on helping make breakfast," Rachel explained, dabbing at Pamela's sticky fingers with a napkin. "I'm beginning to understand why you always said children change everything, Charles." The comment carried weight beyond the simple observation. Rachel had been transforming, softening in subtle ways as she embraced her role as aunt. The sharp-edged corporate warrior was still there, but now tempered by something warmer. Mrs. Sullivan entered with fresh coffee, her presence a constant thread of stability through the changing dynamics. "Mr. Whitmore called," she announced. "He's asking if you'll all join him for dinner this evening." A month ago, such an invitation would have sent Natalie running. Now she merely nodded, though Charles noticed her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "We should go shopping first," Rachel declared, surprising everyone. At their questioning looks, she added, "if we're having a proper family dinner, we should dress the part. Besides, Pamela needs more than that one party dress." Natalie started to protest, but Rachel cut her off. "Consider it 25 years of missed birthday presents. Please, let me do this for my niece." The shopping expedition proved transformative in unexpected ways. As they moved through Chicago's exclusive boutiques, Rachel's expertise in navigating high society merged with Natalie's practical maternal instincts. They found common ground in their shared determination to give Pamela the best of both worlds. "Mother would have loved her," Rachel said quietly as they watched Pamela twirl in a tiny blue dress. "She always wanted grandchildren." "Do you ever hear from her?" Natalie asked gently. Rachel's reflection in the boutique mirror showed a flash of old pain. "Postcards at Christmas. She remarried, lives in Paris now, I think. I think finding out about you and father might have helped her understand why she could never reach him fully." Charles, who had insisted on accompanying them despite the unusual sight of a CEO carrying shopping bags, observed the sisters' growing bond with satisfaction. He'd always seen beneath Rachel's carefully constructed facade to the lonely girl who'd lost both parents in different ways. Back at the mansion, Albert waited in his study, surrounded by old photographs he'd kept hidden for decades. He looked up as Charles entered, his expression vulnerable in a way few had ever seen. "How are they?" he asked, meaning far more than the simple question implied. "Healing," Charles replied, choosing his words carefully. "Rachel is discovering what it means to be a sister. Natalie is learning to trust again. And Pamela," he smiled. "Pamela is teaching us all how to see the world differently." Albert picked up a photograph, Helen holding newborn Natalie. "I had every advantage," he said softly, "every privilege, every opportunity. But I lacked the courage to choose love over appearance, truth over convenience. My daughters grew up paying the price for my cowardice." "It's not too late," Charles reminded him. "Tonight's dinner is a start." The evening arrived with golden light streaming through the mansion's windows. Natalie descended the grand staircase in a simple but elegant dress, Pamela matching in her new blue outfit. Rachel waited at the bottom, looking more like a sister than a corporate heir in her relaxed posture and warm smile. Albert stood by the fireplace, his usual commanding presence softened by obvious nervousness. But when Pamela ran to him with unquestioning affection, years of carefully maintained distance crumbled. Watching from the doorway, Charles saw what others might miss: the slight tremor in Albert's hands as he hugged his granddaughter, the way Rachel's eyes glistened as she watched, the gentle pride in Natalie's expression. This wasn't just a dinner, it was the beginning of healing decades of wounds. "Thank you," Natalie said softly, coming to stand beside him, "for stopping that night in the rain, for seeing more than just a woman in need." Charles turned to her, struck again by her quiet strength. "Thank you for teaching me that some risks are worth taking." The moment was interrupted by Pamela's delighted squeal as Albert produced a wrapped present, her first gift from her grandfather. The sound of genuine laughter filled the mansion's formal spaces, transforming them into something warmer, more alive. Family, Charles realized watching them all, wasn't about perfect facades or carefully maintained images. It was about choosing to be present, about letting love overcome fear, about building something new from the broken pieces of the past. The medical board hearing room buzzed with tension as Dr. Sarah Martinez presented her evidence. Projected on the wall behind her, Christopher Williams's elaborate fraud scheme was laid bare through meticulous documentation and financial records. "The pattern is clear," Martinez concluded, her voice steady. "Mr. Williams systematically altered patient records to cover his embezzlement. When Dr. Foster discovered discrepancies in the pediatric department's budget, he orchestrated her downfall to protect himself." Dr. Anderson, the board chairman, studied the evidence with growing concern. "These alterations are sophisticated. How did you uncover them?" "Because I was there," Martinez replied. "I watched Dr. Foster build the pediatric department into a model of excellence. When she was accused, I knew something wasn't right. It took 2 years, but I finally found proof." In the audience, Natalie sat between Charles and Rachel, her posture rigid with tension. The professional vindication she'd dreamed of was unfolding before her, yet the weight of past trauma made each moment feel surreal. Dr. Anderson turned to address her directly. "Dr. Foster, would you please approach the panel?" As Natalie rose, Charles squeezed her hand briefly. The gesture, subtle but supportive, gave her strength as she walked to the podium. 2 years of doubt and shame tried to cloud her mind, but she pushed them aside. "Dr. Foster Anderson began, your work in pediatric care was groundbreaking. Your patient outcomes were exceptional. Why didn't you fight harder when these accusations emerged?" Natalie took a deep breath, remembering Helen's wisdom about truth being the strongest defense. "I discovered irregularities in our department's financial records. When I brought them to Mr. Williams's attention, he seemed concerned, supportive even. I trusted him. By the time I realized he was manipulating the situation, he had already altered records to implicate me. And you had no one to turn to." The board was convinced by the fabricated evidence. "My colleagues," she paused, glancing at Martinez. "Most were afraid to speak up. I was pregnant, alone, and my priority became protecting my child." A murmur rippled through the room. Several board members exchanged meaningful looks. Dr. Anderson leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "We have reviewed Dr. Martinez's evidence thoroughly. The board would like to formally apologize for our failure to investigate more deeply 2 years ago. Your medical license will be reinstated immediately, with all rights and privileges restored." The words Natalie had dreamed of hearing for 2 years washed over her like a cleansing rain. Behind her, she heard Rachel's quiet exhale of relief, felt the collective support of those who had stood by her. Later that afternoon, Charles called an emergency press conference at Whitmore Tower. The media gathered eagerly, sensing a major story in the making. Rachel stood at his side as he addressed the cameras. "Whitmore Enterprises is proud to announce the appointment of Dr. Natalie Foster as Director of Pediatric Services for our entire healthcare division," Charles declared. Her innovative approach to patient care and proven leadership abilities make her the ideal choice to oversee our expansion of children's medical services. The reporters erupted with questions, but Rachel stepped forward to handle them with practiced ease. Dr. Foster's reinstatement by the medical board confirms what we've known all along. She is an exceptional physician whose commitment to patient care aligns perfectly with our mission. In his private office afterward, Albert reviewed the press coverage with evident pride. The board's decision changes everything, he told Charles. The Morrison Group can't touch us now. Attacking Natalie would only make them look vindictive. This was never about corporate strategy, Charles reminded him gently. This was about doing what's right. Yes, Albert agreed, looking thoughtful. Perhaps it's time I learned that lesson in other areas as well. The transformation of Whitmore Enterprises' healthcare division began immediately under Natalie's leadership. Her first initiative was establishing free pediatric clinics in underserved neighborhoods, a program that quickly garnered positive attention from both medical professionals and the public. Dr. Martinez joined her team as chief of research, their collaborative approach drawing talented physicians who shared their vision of accessible, quality healthcare. The pediatric ward at Chicago General, once a source of pain for Natalie, became a model of innovation and compassionate care. Rachel, watching her sister in action during a board presentation, felt a surge of pride she hadn't expected. Natalie's quiet confidence and clear vision commanded respect naturally, without the calculated authority Rachel had always relied on. "Your mother would be proud," she told Natalie afterward. "Helen always said healthcare should be about helping people, not just managing resources." Natalie smiled, touched by Rachel's increasing references to their shared history. "She taught me that every child deserves the best care possible, regardless of circumstance. I think that's what Father is finally understanding too." Indeed, Albert had begun taking a more personal interest in the healthcare division's community initiatives. His experience with Helen, long buried under corporate ambition, seemed to resurface in his support for programs that put patient care first. The Chicago Medical Association's annual gala provided a perfect stage for the professional community to witness the changes. Natalie, elegant in a blue evening gown, delivered the keynote address about the future of pediatric care. Charles watched from the audience, struck by how naturally she commanded the room. This was the doctor he'd glimpsed beneath the rain-soaked desperation of their first meeting, brilliant, compassionate, and unstoppable when fighting for what she believed in. "She's remarkable," Rachel murmured beside him. "The way she's transformed our entire approach to healthcare. It's like she's healing more than just patients." The truth of Rachel's observation resonated through the following weeks as Natalie's influence spread beyond medicine into the very culture of Whitmore Enterprises. The cold corporate efficiency began to warm with purpose, profit margins balanced against social responsibility in ways that made both thrive. The Whitmore mansion's kitchen filled with unfamiliar sounds of domestic chaos as Pamela, perched safely on a counter stool, helped Mrs. Sullivan prepare Sunday dinner. This weekly tradition had emerged organically over the past months, transforming the formal dining room into a space of genuine family connection. "More flour," sweetie Mrs. Sullivan guided Pamela's small hands as they worked the dough. "Just like your mother taught you." Natalie watched from the doorway, struck by how naturally her daughter had adapted to this new life. The kitchen, once Mrs. Sullivan's solitary domain, now regularly hosted impromptu cooking lessons and family gatherings that would have been unimaginable months ago. Rachel entered, looking refreshingly casual in weekend attire, carrying a bottle of wine. "I found another one of Father's favorites in the cellar," she announced, "though I'm beginning to suspect he prefers Natalie's choice of California Reds." The easy banter between the sisters had become natural, their initial awkwardness replaced by genuine affection. They had discovered shared traits beyond their father's determined spirit, a dry sense of humor, a love of classical music, and an unexpected competitive streak at family game nights. "Speaking of Father," Rachel continued, lowering her voice, "he's in his study again, going through old photographs. I think today's date holds some significance." Natalie nodded, understanding immediately. It would have been Mother's birthday. The knowledge hung between them. A shared grief for different reasons, Rachel mourning the mother who left, Natalie the one who protected her through silence. Their eyes met in perfect understanding. "We should do something," Rachel suggested. "Honor her memory somehow." Charles found them later in Albert's study, the sisters sitting on either side of their father as he shared stories about Helen. Old photographs covered his desk: Helen at the hospital, Helen at charity events, Helen holding baby Natalie with a radiant smile. "She loved gardenias," Albert was saying, his voice soft with memory. "Used to say they reminded her of pure joy." "The garden," Rachel exclaimed suddenly. "The east section needs replanting. We could create a memorial garden, gardenias, her favorite roses." Albert looked up, emotion making his voice rough. Helen would have loved that. The project became a family endeavor. Weekend board meetings were replaced by gardening sessions, with Pamela enthusiastically helping everyone plant flowers. Even Charles, more comfortable in boardrooms than flower beds, found himself regularly rolling up his sleeves to help. One Sunday morning, as dawn painted the sky in gentle pastels, Natalie found Charles already in the garden. He was carefully tending to a newly planted gardenia, his usual impeccable appearance replaced by casual gardening clothes. "You're here early," she observed, offering him coffee. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, accepting the cup. "Been thinking about what Helen's garden represents, how healing can come in unexpected ways." Natalie settled on a nearby bench, understanding his meaning. The garden had become more than a memorial, it was a symbol of their evolving family, of growth emerging from pain. "Rachel mentioned the Morrison Group has backed off completely," she said. Charles nodded, joining her on the bench. "Your success with the healthcare division changed the narrative. They can't attack what's clearly benefiting the community." The morning light caught the dew on the gardenias, making them sparkle. Pamela's laughter drifted from the kitchen, where she was undoubtedly helping Mrs. Sullivan with breakfast preparations. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," Natalie confessed. "That night in the rain feels like another lifetime." "You've changed all of us," Charles replied quietly. "Rachel's found the sister she never knew she needed. Albert's learning to be the father he should have been. And he paused, their eyes meeting. "I'm learning that success isn't measured in profit margins." The moment was interrupted by Rachel's arrival, carrying breakfast trays. "Family picnic," she announced. "Father's idea. He's bringing Pamela out once she finishes helping with the pancakes." They spread blankets on the grass, creating an informal dining space surrounded by Helen's flowers. Albert joined them, Pamela riding on his shoulders, her giggles echoing through the garden. As they shared breakfast, trading stories and easy conversation, Natalie observed the subtle changes in everyone. Rachel's sharp edges had softened, though her wit remained keen. Albert's corporate mask had given way to genuine warmth, especially with Pamela. And Charles. Charles had found a balance between the driven CEO and the man who stopped to help in the rain. Mrs. Sullivan, bringing out fresh coffee, paused to survey the scene. "The house hasn't felt this alive in decades," she remarked quietly to Natalie. "Miss Helen would be pleased." Later that afternoon, as sunset painted the garden in gold, the family gathered for a small ceremony. Albert unveiled a simple marble bench, engraved with Helen's favorite quote about healing hearts and growing love. "To Helen," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me too late that love is the greatest legacy we can leave." To Mother, Natalie and Rachel said together, their free hands clasped. To family, Charles added softly, his eyes meeting Natalie's. Pamela, not quite understanding but feeling the moment's importance, placed a gardenia on the bench. The simple gesture brought tears to everyone's eyes, a perfect expression of innocent love healing old wounds. The envelope arrived at Whitmore Tower on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. No return address, just Charles Green's name written in familiar handwriting that made his blood run cold. Inside, a single photograph Natalie and Pamela in Helen's memorial garden, clearly taken without their knowledge. The accompanying note was brief: "Let's discuss the real story behind Whitmore's healthcare acquisitions. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., the Drake Hotel. Come alone, or the press gets everything." Christopher Williams's signature was unnecessary. The threat in his words was clear enough. Charles stood at his office window, the city sprawling below as he weighed his options. The board meeting that morning had celebrated record profits from their healthcare division. Natalie's leadership had transformed their hospitals into models of excellence. Now, everything they'd built stood threatened by a ghost from the past. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Green? Dr. Foster is here for your lunch meeting." Natalie entered, radiant with success from her morning rounds at the pediatric clinic. Her smile faded as she registered his expression. "What's wrong?" Charles hesitated, then handed her the envelope. He watched her face pale as she recognized the handwriting, saw her hands tremble slightly as she read the note. "He's been watching us," she whispered. "All this time." "I won't let him hurt you again," Charles said firmly. "We'll increase security, move you and Pamela to a safer location." No, Natalie's voice gained strength. "I won't hide. Not anymore. Not from him." Before Charles could respond, Rachel burst into the office, her usual composure shattered. "Have you seen this?" She thrust her tablet forward, displaying a financial news website. The headline made both Charles and Natalie freeze. Questions arise about Whitmore Healthcare Acquisitions. Anonymous source promises revelations. "The Morrison Group stock is already rising," Rachel continued. "They're positioning themselves to take advantage of any scandal." Charles reached for his phone. "I'll call Albert." "Don't!" The voice came from the doorway where Albert Whitmore himself stood, looking older than his years. "Christopher Williams already contacted me. He knows everything about Helen, about the old medical board decisions, about the money I've been sending through shell companies. He's threatening to expose it all." The four of them stood in tense silence, each processing the implications. Their carefully reconstructed family happiness, Natalie's professional restoration, the company's success, all balanced on a knife's edge. "He wants money," Rachel said flatly. "How much?" "It's not just about money," Natalie interjected, her medical training helping her analyze the situation clinically. "Christopher enjoys power, control. He wants to prove he can destroy what he couldn't have." Charles studied the photograph again, anger rising at the violation it represented. "We could go to the police." "With what evidence?" Albert interrupted. "Everything he's threatening to expose is true. The questionable medical board decisions, the covered-up relationship with Helen, the secret payments. We made choices, Charles. Now we're facing the consequences." Natalie squared her shoulders, a familiar determination entering her expression. "No. Christopher's power has always come from secrets, from people's fear of truth. Perhaps it's time we take that power away." "What are you suggesting?" Rachel asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "We tell the truth. All of it. On our terms before he can twist it." Albert sank into a chair, the weight of decades of secrets visible in his posture. The board would never survive the scandal. The Morrison Group would take control within weeks. "Then we rebuild," Natalie said simply. "Together, as a family. Isn't that worth more than appearance?" Charles moved to stand beside her, his decision made. "She's right. We've let fear of scandal dictate our choices for too long. Look where it's led us." Rachel's analytical mind was already working on possibilities. We could frame it as a story of redemption. The prodigal father acknowledging his daughter, using his resources to right past wrongs through healthcare initiatives. "The press would crucify us," Albert protested weakly. "Perhaps we deserve it," Rachel replied, surprising everyone. "But we'd face it honestly, together." And isn't that what Mother tried to teach you all those years ago? The mention of Caroline Whitmore, Rachel's mother, added another layer to the moment. Here they were, a family shaped by secrets and separations, finally choosing truth over appearances. Charles's phone buzzed another message from Christopher. TikTok. Time's running out. Natalie reached for the phone, her fingers brushing Charles's as she took it. With steady hands, she typed a response: the Drake Hotel, tomorrow at 2 p.m. But we'll all be there. It's time for truth. The message sent with a quiet chime that seemed to echo through the office. 4 pairs of eyes met, acknowledging the point of no return they'd just crossed. I should call the PR team, Rachel said, already reaching for her phone. No, Albert stopped her. First we need to talk, really talk. About everything I've kept hidden, everything that led us here. You all deserve the whole truth before we face whatever comes next. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows, Albert Whitmore began to speak. The story that emerged of love and fear, of choices made and roads not taken, would form the foundation of their defense against Christopher's threats. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and possible ruin. But today, in this moment, truth was finally having its say. The private vault in Albert Whitmore's study had remained sealed for 25 years. Now, as Rachel watched her father enter the combination with trembling fingers, the weight of unspoken history filled the room. Inside, meticulously organized files chronicled a past that would reshape their understanding of everything. Your mother found these, Albert explained, removing a stack of letters bound with faded blue ribbon. The night she decided to leave. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them afterward. Rachel accepted the bundle, recognizing Helen Foster's elegant handwriting. The letters dated back to before Natalie's birth, each one a chapter in a love story that had shaped their lives without their knowledge. The first letter made her breath catch. Dearest Albert, the board meeting today was another reminder of how complicated our situation has become. The merger could transform healthcare in Chicago, help so many people. But at what cost to us, to our child? Mother knew, Rachel said quietly. About Helen, about Natalie. That's why she left. But Albert sank into his leather chair, age evident in every movement. Caroline didn't just leave because of the affair. She left because I chose the company over love, not once, but twice. She couldn't bear to watch me repeat the same mistake with Helen and Natalie. Further in the vault, Rachel discovered financial records detailing decades of careful support, private school tuition, medical school payments, trust funds established under obscure corporate entities. Each transaction represented her father's attempt to provide for Natalie without acknowledging her publicly. You've been watching over her entire life, Rachel realized. Every achievement, every struggle. From a distance, Albert admitted, the coward's way. I told myself I was protecting everyone, the company, our reputation, your future. But I was really just protecting myself from having to face my choices. A photograph slipped from between the letters. Helen at a hospital fundraiser, standing near Albert but carefully distant, her smile containing a sadness Rachel now understood. The date stamp showed it was taken just months before Helen's final departure. She gave you an ultimatum, didn't she? Rachel asked, though she already knew the answer. Helen said she couldn't bear to see Natalie grow up watching her father pretend she didn't exist. She'd rather raise her alone than subject her to that pain. Albert's voice cracked. I promised to provide financially to ensure their security. Helen said some things money couldn't buy. Rachel thought of her own childhood, of galas and board meetings, of a father more comfortable with spreadsheets than emotional conversations. She was right. The discovery of a smaller box within the vault changed everything. Inside, Rachel found letters from her own mother that had never been sent, dozens of them, spanning the years after she left. I couldn't bear to read them, Albert confessed. Each one reminded me of another failure. But Rachel opened the most recent one, dated just last year. Albert, I saw Natalie's picture in the medical journal. She has your determination. your drive to help others. Rachel has your strength. How tragic that your daughters grew up strangers because of pride. Some successes aren't measured in profit margins. The words blurred as tears filled Rachel's eyes. All these years she'd thought her mother's departure was about their family alone. Now she understood it was about something larger, the price of choosing appearance over authenticity, power over love. Her phone buzzed, displaying Charles's message about the meeting arrangements for tomorrow. Christopher Williams waited in the wings, ready to expose everything she'd just discovered. But looking at her father now, seeing the toll of decades of secrecy, Rachel realized something crucial. "We can't let him win by using truth as a weapon," she said firmly. "These letters, these records, they tell a story of love, however imperfect. Of choices made for complex reasons. That's the story we need to tell." Albert looked up, surprised by the strength in her voice. "The board won't see it that way. The shareholders." "Forget the shareholders," Rachel interrupted. "For once, Father, think about family first. Real family, not the corporate image we've hidden behind." She gathered the letters carefully, including both Helen's and her mother's. Natalie deserves to read these. To understand that she was loved, even if that love was complicated by fear and circumstance. The sun had set by the time Rachel finished organizing the vault's contents, each document and photograph telling part of their family's complex history. Tomorrow, they would face Christopher Williams with this truth as their shield. As she prepared to leave the study, Albert spoke again, his voice heavy with realization. "Your mother would be proud of you, Rachel. You've become the person she always hoped I could be." Rachel paused in the doorway, thinking of all the years lost to silence and pride. "It's not too late to become that person, Father. Starting tomorrow, we face everything together as a family." The Chicago Tribune's front page headline struck like a thunderbolt. "Whitmore Empire's hidden heir healthcare dynasty built on secrets and sacrifice." Margaret Chen's byline led into a story that would reshape the city's business landscape. Inside the Whitmore Towers executive conference room, the emergency board meeting had devolved into barely controlled chaos. Marcus Reynolds, the lead director, paced before the floor-to-ceiling windows as he read aloud from the article. Sources close to the company confirmed that Dr. Natalie Foster, recently appointed Director of Pediatric Services, is the previously unacknowledged daughter of Albert Whitmore. The revelation raises questions about the recent healthcare acquisitions and the company's dramatic shift in medical policy. Charles stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention even in crisis. "Before we proceed, you should know that we chose to release this information ourselves." Christopher Williams attempted to blackmail the company. "So it's true," Reynolds interrupted, his face flushed. "Everything in this article? The secret payments, the medical board cover-ups, the systematic concealment of an heir." "Yes," Albert's voice carried across the room, steady despite his obvious fatigue. "Every word. And I'm prepared to take full responsibility." Rachel, seated beside her father, straightened in her chair. The story also details our healthcare division's remarkable success under Dr. Foster's leadership. Her qualifications and achievements stand on their own merit. The board erupted in overlapping voices until Charles raised his hand for silence. "The Morrison Group is already making moves to challenge our hospital acquisitions. We need to decide our response now." Outside, reporters gathered in the plaza below, their cameras trained on the tower's gleaming facade. Inside the mansion, Natalie watched the coverage on television, Pamela sleeping peacefully in her lap. Mrs. Sullivan brought her tea, her presence a quiet comfort. "The phones haven't stopped," the housekeeper reported. "Reporters, shareholders, even old hospital colleagues wanting to speak with you." Natalie nodded, her attention caught by a breaking news alert. Christopher Williams had called a press conference at the Morrison Group headquarters. The cameras focused on his familiar face, still handsome but harder than she remembered. "The Whitmore family's admission raises serious ethical concerns," Christopher declared, his practiced sincerity perfectly calibrated. How many other decisions were influenced by personal relationships rather than proper corporate governance? The irony of his statement might have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Natalie's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Martinez. The entire pediatric department is behind you. We're ready to speak out about the real story. Back in the boardroom, Rachel was presenting a strategic response plan. We control the narrative by focusing on transformation and redemption. The company's healthcare initiatives under Dr. Foster's leadership have improved thousands of lives. That's not despite our family connections, it's because of them. The shareholders won't care about feel-good stories, Reynolds objected. Our stock is already down 12%. Then we give them numbers, Charles countered, sliding reports across the table. Patient satisfaction up 40%. Treatment success rates improved by 35%. Operating costs down while quality of care rises. Dr. Foster's leadership has created measurable value. Albert cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. I've prepared a statement. Not as CEO, but as a father. He unfolded a paper with trembling hands. 25 years ago, I chose corporate success over personal integrity. I told myself I was protecting my family, my company, my legacy. Today I understand that true legacy isn't measured in stock prices or market share. The room fell silent as Albert continued, his voice growing stronger. My daughter Natalie has taught me that healing comes in many forms. Through her work, she's brought not just medical care, but humanity back to our healthcare system. I can no longer hide behind corporate facades. It's time to acknowledge not just my mistakes, but the remarkable woman who grew up in spite of them. The statement was broadcast live across every major network. As Albert spoke, something shifted in the public perception. Social media filled with stories from parents whose children had been treated in Whitmore hospitals, from staff members describing Dr. Foster's leadership, from community members touched by the new outreach programs. Dr. Martinez organized a press conference of her own, surrounded by hospital staff who shared their experiences working with Natalie. The narrative began to change from scandal to redemption, from corporate intrigue to human connection. By evening, the Morrison Group's attacks seemed increasingly bitter and personal. Christopher's obvious vendetta undermined his credibility, while the Whitmore family's transparency earned respect even from critics. Rachel found Natalie in Helen's garden, watching the sunset paint the gardenias in golden light. The board voted, she reported softly. They're standing with us. Even Reynolds came around after seeing the community response. Natalie smiled faintly. Mother always said truth has its own power. I never fully understood until now. There will still be challenges, Rachel cautioned. The Morrison Group won't give up easily. No, Natalie agreed, but we'll face them together. As a family. Inside the mansion, Charles watched them through the window, sisters finding strength in their connection, healing the wounds of the past. The company would weather this storm, but more importantly, something new and precious had been preserved, the truth of who they were and who they could become. St. Michael's Hospital's emergency department erupted into focused activity as Pamela was rushed through the doors, her small form dwarfed by the gurney. Natalie ran alongside, her professional composure cracking as she watched her daughter struggle for breath. Severe respiratory distress, fever of 104, the paramedic reported. Symptoms began approximately 2 hours ago, rapidly progressing. Dr. Sarah Martinez met them at the entrance to pediatric intensive care, her face showing both professional concern and personal worry. Treatment room 1, she directed, already assessing Pamela's condition with experienced eyes. Charles arrived moments later, having followed the ambulance from the mansion. He found Rachel in the waiting area, her usual corporate polish replaced by genuine fear. What happened? She was fine at breakfast, Rachel answered, her voice tight. Then suddenly, the breathing problems. Natalie recognized it immediately. Some kind of severe allergic reaction. Inside the treatment room, Natalie forced herself to step back, allowing her colleagues to work. Her medical training warred with maternal instinct, as she watched them start IV lines and administer medication. Pamela's frightened eyes sought her out, small hands reaching. "Mummy's here, baby," she managed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The doctors are helping you feel better." Dr. Anderson, the chief of pediatrics, arrived to consult. His presence spoke volumes about the seriousness of the situation. Dr. Foster, he addressed Natalie formally, respecting her dual role as physician and mother. "We need to discuss treatment options." The clinical discussion that followed was interrupted by Albert's arrival. He stood in the doorway, looking lost without his usual commanding presence. "I came as soon as I heard. What can I do?" Before anyone could respond, Pamela's monitors began alarming. Her oxygen levels were dropping despite the supplemental oxygen, her small body fighting against an invisible enemy. "We need to intubate," Dr. Martinez decided, moving with practiced efficiency. "Natalie, you should step out." "No," Natalie's voice was firm. "I'm staying with my daughter." The next hours passed in a blur of medical interventions and tense monitoring. Outside the treatment room, the waiting area filled with family and supporters. Charles handled the necessary paperwork while Rachel coordinated with hospital administration. Albert paced, for once indifferent to his public image, as he prayed openly for his granddaughter. Mrs. Sullivan arrived with comfort items from home. Pamela's favorite blanket, the stuffed bear from Charles. She found Rachel staring out the window, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Your sister needs you," she said gently. "Not as a corporate executive, but as family." Rachel nodded, squaring her shoulders before entering the treatment room. She found Natalie holding Pamela's hand, speaking softly to her sedated form. Without words, Rachel took her sister's other hand, offering silent support. Dr. Martinez's return with test results drew everyone's attention. "We've identified the trigger," she reported. "A rare but severe reaction to a new hospital cleaning solution. It was just introduced in our pediatric wing yesterday." The implications hit Charles first. The Morrison Group supplies hospital sanitization products. They just won the contract last month. "Impossible," Albert breathed. But Rachel was already pulling out her phone, her investigative instincts awakened. The contract approval was rushed through, she discovered, scrolling through documents. Safety testing documentation appears complete, but... Wait, her eyes widened. "These certification dates don't match our records." Charles moved to look over her shoulder, his expression darkening. "Christopher Williams' signature is on the approval forms. He's on their board now." He knew, Natalie said quietly, her focus never leaving Pamela. He knew about Pamela's rare allergy. It was in her medical records at Chicago General, the records he altered 2 years ago. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors. The attack wasn't just professional anymore, it had become deeply, frighteningly personal. Dr. Anderson returned with updated blood work results. "She's stabilizing," he reported, reviewing the numbers. "The new treatment protocol is working." "Dr. Foster, your suggestion about the modified antihistamine combination was crucial." Natalie nodded, too exhausted for pride. She had drawn on every bit of her medical knowledge to help devise her daughter's treatment plan, forcing herself to think as a doctor when her heart was crying out as a mother. Charles stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I want a complete investigation of how this product was approved. Every signature, every test result, every piece of documentation." "Already on it," Rachel confirmed, her fingers flying over her phone. "I'm calling in our best forensic accountants and safety compliance teams." Albert moved to stand behind Natalie's chair, resting a hand on her shoulder. The gesture contained years of regret and newfound determination. "Christopher Williams has gone too far. This time he'll face more than just corporate consequences." Dr. Martinez excused herself to coordinate with the hospital's legal team, but paused at the door. "The other children in the pediatric wing," she said. "We've moved them all to a secure ward and switched back to our previous cleaning protocols. They're safe. Natalie closed her eyes briefly in relief. Even in crisis, her concern for other patients remained. It was this quality, this genuine care for others, that had made her such an effective doctor and leader. As night fell over Chicago, the family maintained their vigil. Mrs. Sullivan organized a rotation of rest periods, though no one strayed far from Pamela's room. The crisis had stripped away corporate titles and public images, leaving only the essence of family bonds. Charles found himself watching Natalie in the dim light, marveling at her strength. She had faced professional ruin, public scandal, and now this personal attack with unwavering grace. In protecting her daughter, she showed the same determination that had first drawn him to her that rainy night. The Whitmore Towers executive floor buzzed with controlled chaos as legal teams and security experts coordinated their response. Marcus Reynolds, who had opposed the family's transparency just days ago, now led the charge against the Morrison Group's attack. The falsified safety documentation creates clear liability, he explained to the assembled board members. Our investigation has uncovered systematic manipulation of test results dating back to the contract approval. Charles stood at the head of the conference table, his demeanor reflecting both corporate authority and personal stakes. The FDA has been notified. They're launching an immediate review of all Morrison Group medical supply certifications. Rachel entered, tablet in hand, her expression grimly satisfied. We've traced the paper trail. Christopher Williams joined Morrison's board 3 months ago through a shell company. He's been orchestrating this from the beginning. The evidence mounted on screens around the room altered safety reports, backdated certifications, and a carefully hidden network of shell companies linking Christopher to key decision-makers. The attack on Pamela had been precisely calculated, targeting not just the company but the heart of the family. The shareholders are understandably concerned, the chief legal counsel reported. Morrison's stock jumped 15% when news of the incident broke. They're positioning this as a quality control issue in our hospitals. Charles's response was measured but firm. Prepare a complete disclosure package for the SEC. Every document, every connection, every manipulation. Christopher Williams didn't just compromise corporate ethics, he deliberately endangered patients. The hospital board convened an emergency session with Dr. Martinez presenting their findings. The revelation that a board member had knowingly approved dangerous products sent shockwaves through Chicago's medical community. We've identified 17 other facilities using Morrison supplies, Dr. Anderson announced. The recall is already underway. But the damage to public trust, he trailed off. The implications clear. Albert Whitmore, who had remained largely silent during the proceedings, finally spoke. I've spent decades building this company on the premise that profit should never compromise patient care. Christopher Williams has violated not just laws but the fundamental ethics of healthcare. The corporate response team worked through the night, coordinating with regulatory agencies and healthcare partners. Rachel's investigative skills, honed through years of complex negotiations, proved invaluable in unraveling Christopher's schemes. He left a trail, she explained to Charles during a brief break. He wanted us to find it, eventually wanted us to know how thoroughly he'd planned this revenge. The legal analysts projected devastating consequences for the Morrison Group. Their stock began to fall as more safety violations came to light. James Morrison himself called an emergency board meeting to address the crisis. Inside Morrison's headquarters, Christopher Williams faced growing hostility from his fellow board members. His carefully constructed plan was unraveling as the full scope of his actions became clear. You assured us this was a legitimate business strategy, Morrison thundered, his face flushed with anger. Instead, you've exposed us to criminal liability, endangering children for corporate sabotage. The FDA's preliminary report arrived mid-morning, prompting immediate action from regulatory authorities. Trading in Morrison Group shares was temporarily suspended as investigators descended on their facilities. Back at Whitmore Tower, Charles coordinated the company's public response. "We're implementing comprehensive safety reviews across all our healthcare facilities," he announced to the press. "Every supplier, every product, every protocol will be thoroughly vetted." The business media began shifting their coverage. Headlines moved from Whitmore family scandal to corporate whistleblower exposes healthcare safety crisis. The narrative transformed as the public recognized the broader implications of Christopher's actions. Rachel organized a joint statement from major hospital administrators supporting Whitmore Enterprises' safety initiatives. "This isn't about corporate competition anymore," she told reporters. "This is about protecting patients and restoring trust in healthcare systems." The board reconvened to review the latest developments. Marcus Reynolds, now fully aligned with the family's position, presented updated projections. "Our stock has stabilized," he reported. "The market is responding positively to our transparent handling of the crisis." Morrison Group, however, faces potential bankruptcy as lawsuits begin. Charles's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Pamela's condition was improving. The personal and professional crises seemed to be turning a corner simultaneously. Christopher Williams will face criminal charges, the legal team confirmed. The evidence of deliberate endangerment is overwhelming. Albert stood at his office window, watching the city below. "I spent years protecting corporate interests at the expense of personal truth," he reflected. "Christopher's actions have shown us the ultimate cost of that mindset." The day ended with a clear victory in sight, but no one felt like celebrating. The business crisis had been managed, but the personal toll, the sight of Pamela fighting for breath, the knowledge that corporate greed had threatened an innocent child, would not be forgotten. The hospital chapel provided a quiet sanctuary from the constant beeping of monitors and hushed medical discussions. Natalie sat in the dim light, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. The past 48 hours had tested her strength in ways she'd never imagined possible. Through the chapel's stained glass windows, dawn painted abstract patterns across the floor. Natalie heard familiar footsteps approaching Charles, who hadn't left the hospital since Pamela was admitted. "You should rest," he said softly, settling into the pew beside her. "I keep thinking about choices," Natalie replied, her voice rough from lack of sleep. "The choice Mother made to protect me by leaving. The choice I made to fight for my career. The choice Christopher made to pursue revenge at any cost." The mention of Christopher brought a shadow to Charles's face. The latest reports confirmed the deliberate nature of the attack. He had specifically targeted Pamela's ward with the contaminated supplies. "I thought I was protecting Pamela by rebuilding our life," Natalie continued, emotions finally spilling over. "Instead, I exposed her to danger. My professional ambitions, my desire to clear my name, was it worth risking her safety?" Charles turned to face her fully. "You can't blame yourself for Christopher's actions. You fought to provide Pamela a better life, to show her that truth and integrity matter." In the pediatric ICU, Rachel maintained her vigil by Pamela's bedside. The corporate warrior had been replaced by a protective aunt who read stories hour after hour, ensuring her niece never woke alone. Albert found her there, his own face lined with guilt and worry. "I should have stopped this years ago," he said quietly. "When Christopher first showed his true nature at the hospital, I could have prevented all of this." "We all missed the signs," Rachel acknowledged. "We were so focused on corporate success that we forgot success means nothing without humanity." Dr. Martinez entered with the latest test results, offering a small smile. "Her numbers are improving. The new treatment protocol is working exactly as Natalie predicted." The good news spread quickly through the family, but its impact was tempered by the weight of recent events. They had come too close to tragedy, and the realization of their vulnerability had shaken them deeply. Later that evening, as Pamela slept peacefully for the first time since the crisis began, the family gathered in the private waiting room. Mrs. Sullivan had brought food that no one felt like eating, though they appreciated her steady presence. "The media is calling for interviews," Rachel reported without her usual strategic enthusiasm. They want the personal angle, the family drama behind the corporate headlines. But no more media, Albert decided firmly. No more putting appearance above well-being. We focus on healing all of us. Charles watched Natalie through the observation window as she gently stroked Pamela's hair. The sight stirred something deep within him, a recognition of what truly mattered beyond business success and corporate power. "I'm stepping down as CEO," he announced quietly. The room fell silent. Rachel was the first to find her voice. "Charles, the company needs you now more than ever." "The company needs leadership that remembers humanity comes first," he countered. I watched Pamela fight for breath because we were all too focused on corporate battles to see the real threat. "I won't make that mistake again." Natalie appeared in the doorway, having heard his declaration. "You can't give up everything you've built," she protested. "The healthcare division is making real changes, helping real people." "I'm not giving up," Charles replied, meeting her eyes. "I'm choosing what matters most. The company will survive with new leadership. But this family, what we've built here, that's irreplaceable." The truth of his words resonated with everyone in the room. They had all reached a breaking point, a moment of clarity where priorities shifted and values realigned. Albert stood, his decision evident in his bearing. "I'll call an emergency board meeting tomorrow. It's time for real change, not just in leadership but in purpose. We built this company to help people. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that." Rachel's analytical mind was already working through implications, but her heart recognized the rightness of these choices. "We'll need to restructure everything," she said, but without her usual focus on market impact. As night settled over the hospital, the family remained together, their bonds strengthened by crisis and choice. Pamela's steady breathing provided a peaceful counterpoint to their quiet conversations about future plans and new beginnings. In the softest hours before dawn, Natalie found Charles still keeping watch. "Thank you," she said simply, "for reminding us all what matters most." His response was to take her hand, a gesture that spoke of support, understanding, and possibilities yet to unfold. Together they watched the night sky lighten, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as a family, stronger for having been broken, wiser for having lost their way, and more determined than ever to protect what truly mattered. The leather-bound journal lay on Albert's desk, its pages worn with time yet carefully preserved. Mrs. Sullivan had discovered it while preparing Helen's memorial garden, tucked away in a weathered cedar box beneath the greenhouse floorboards. "She must have left it before her final departure," Mrs. Sullivan explained, her voice gentle as she handed the journal to Natalie. "Perhaps she knew someday you would need her words." Natalie traced the embossed initials on the cover HF, her fingers trembling slightly. The morning sun streamed through the study windows, casting a warm glow over the gathered family as she opened to the first entry. "My dearest Natalie," Helen's elegant handwriting filled the pages. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally emerged. There are so many things I wanted to tell you, so many choices I need to explain." Rachel sat beside her sister, their shoulders touching in silent support as Natalie began reading aloud. "Albert Whitmore came into our lives like a force of nature. I was a young nurse, idealistic and determined to make a difference. He was a rising business leader with dreams of transforming healthcare. We shared a vision of hospitals that put patients first, of medical care accessible to all." Albert stood by the window, his reflection showing the weight of memories as Helen's words painted their past. "Our love was real, but so were the complications. The merger that would revolutionize Chicago's healthcare system hung in the balance. The board would never approve if scandal touched their chairman. Albert faced an impossible choice: his vision for helping thousands or his love for us." The journal detailed Helen's own struggle with the decision. Her entries revealed a depth of understanding that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "I chose to leave not out of weakness but strength. Sometimes love means protecting others from impossible choices. Albert's work would help countless families. I could give Natalie a life free from public scrutiny and corporate politics. My daughter would grow up knowing she was loved completely, without division or compromise. Charles watched Natalie's face as she read, seeing the pieces of her past finally falling into place. Helen's words continued, spanning years of quiet observation and maternal pride. I see so much of Albert in you, Natalie. Your dedication to healing, your unwavering integrity. But you also have something uniquely your own, the courage to choose love over appearance, truth over convenience. Never lose that, my darling. The most recent entries addressed the present with uncanny prescience. The Whitmore name brings both privilege and responsibility. If you're reading this, you've likely found your way back to that legacy. Remember that true family isn't built on corporate success or social standing, but on love, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. Rachel wiped tears from her eyes as Natalie read Helen's final entry. My greatest hope is that someday you'll all find each other not as business allies or social connections, but as the family you were meant to be. Albert's strength, Rachel's loyalty, and your compassion could create something remarkable. Love isn't about perfect choices, but about choosing each other despite imperfection. The room fell silent as Natalie closed the journal. Albert's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with emotion. She understood everything: the fear, the pride, the misguided priorities. While I was building an empire, Helen was preserving our humanity. She was protecting all of us, Rachel realized, not just from scandal, but from losing ourselves to corporate ambition. Charles moved to stand behind Natalie's chair, his presence offering quiet support. Helen's wisdom saved Pamela too. Her medical insights in these pages helped develop the treatment protocol. Indeed, scattered throughout the journal were Helen's detailed observations about rare allergic conditions, including notes about genetic factors that had proven crucial in treating Pamela's crisis. Mother never stopped being a healer, Natalie said softly. Even when she couldn't practice officially, she kept learning, kept caring. Mrs. Sullivan brought tea, her practical compassion a living echo of Helen's influence. The family gathered in the study, sharing memories and insights as morning turned to afternoon. Helen's words had given them not just understanding of the past, but a blueprint for the future. Albert gathered the courage to voice what they were all feeling. We can't change the choices of the past, but we can honor Helen's wisdom by choosing differently now. She saw the best in all of us, the potential for something greater than corporate success. The Whitmore Towers executive boardroom held an unusual silence as Charles stood before the assembled directors. His formal resignation letter lay unopened on the polished mahogany table, but his words carried unwavering conviction. For 20 years I've measured success in profit margins and market share, he began. Recent events have shown me the cost of that narrow vision. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO to focus on restructuring our healthcare initiatives from the ground up. Marcus Reynolds, his usual skepticism tempered by recent events, leaned forward. The shareholders will demand answers. The stock price has finally stabilized after the Morrison crisis. Some answers matter more than stock prices, Charles replied, retrieving Helen's journal from his briefcase. This document outlines a healthcare philosophy we've forgotten, one that puts healing above profit, humanity above corporate metrics. Rachel, seated at her father's right hand, recognized her cue. She distributed comprehensive folders to each board member. These documents detail our proposed restructuring. We're not abandoning profit, we're redefining how we measure success. The presentation that followed revealed months of careful planning. Charts and projections demonstrated how ethical healthcare practices could align with sustainable profitability. Helen's medical insights, preserved in her journal, provided the foundation for innovative patient care protocols. Albert listened with growing pride as his children presented their vision. The corporate titan who had once chosen power over love found himself moved by their commitment to balancing business success with human compassion. The Morrison Group's attacks exposed our vulnerabilities, Rachel explained. but they also revealed our greatest strength, the trust of our patients and staff. Dr. Foster's leadership of the pediatric division has shown us a better way forward. In her office at Chicago General, Natalie faced her own moment of truth. The medical board had offered to fast-track her reinstatement as chief of pediatrics, with additional oversight of research programs. "Your mother's research notes are revolutionary," Dr. Martinez explained, reviewing Helen's documented cases. "Combined with your innovations in treatment protocols, we could transform pediatric care standards across the country." Natalie studied the familiar walls of her office, remembering the young doctor she'd been before Christopher's betrayal. "I want to heal more than just patients," she said finally. "Our entire approach to healthcare needs rehabilitation." The decision crystallized as she watched Pamela, now fully recovered, playing in Helen's garden through her office window. The child's laughter carried up to where Charles stood beside her, a reminder of what truly mattered. "I'll accept the position," Natalie told the board, "but with conditions. We implement Helen's patient-first protocols throughout the system. Every decision, every policy must serve the fundamental goal of healing." The corporate restructuring sent ripples through Chicago's business community. When Albert Whitmore announced his retirement as chairman, stepping into an advisory role focused on healthcare accessibility, the financial press predicted disaster. Instead, something remarkable emerged. Rachel's strategic brilliance, combined with Charles's ethical leadership and Natalie's medical expertise, began transforming Whitmore Enterprises into a model of corporate responsibility. The cost was measured in more than dollars. Charles's resignation from everyday operations meant sacrificing the power he'd spent decades accumulating. Rachel stepped back from numerous lucrative international ventures to focus on domestic healthcare initiatives. Helen would understand, Albert remarked one evening, watching his family gathered in the garden that bore her name. She knew the greatest achievements often required the greatest sacrifices. The transition wasn't smooth. Shareholders questioned the new direction. Competitors tried to exploit what they perceived as weakness. But as Helen had predicted in her journal, truth and integrity proved stronger than market forces. 1 month after the restructuring announcement, Natalie stood before a national healthcare conference, presenting the integrated care model they'd developed based on Helen's insights. Her audience included many who had once doubted her, including former board members who had supported Christopher's accusations. "Healthcare isn't just about treating symptoms," she concluded, her mother's wisdom flowing through her words. "It's about healing the whole person and sometimes healing entire systems that have lost their way." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her speech. It was recognition of a fundamental truth Helen had understood decades ago, that genuine care for human well-being could coexist with professional success. The Chicago Tribune's Sunday edition featured a striking image: Pamela sitting in Helen's memorial garden, surrounded by children from the hospital's oncology ward. The headline read, "Whitmore Legacy Reborn: How One Family's Crisis Changed Healthcare." Inside St. Michael's Hospital, the transformation was evident. The newly renovated pediatric wing, designed according to Helen's patient-centered principles, bustled with activity. Natalie moved through the halls, stopping to check on patients and support staff alike. "Dr. Foster," a nurse called out, "Mrs. Chen's son is responding well to the new treatment protocol, just like your mother predicted in her research." The validation of Helen's work brought a quiet smile to Natalie's face. Her mother's medical insights, preserved through years of careful observation, were proving revolutionary in treating complex cases. Rachel appeared at the nurse's station, having traded her designer suits for more practical attire. She now spent 3 days a week working directly with hospital administration, implementing the integrated care model they'd developed. "The community outreach numbers are impressive," she reported, falling into step beside her sister. "The free clinic program has reached over 5,000 families in the past month alone." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Albert, who had developed a habit of visiting the pediatric ward regularly. The former corporate titan now sat for hours with young patients, reading stories and offering grandfatherly comfort. The Morrison Group investigation results are in, he informed them quietly. Christopher's trial begins next week. The news brought a complex mix of emotions. Christopher's actions had nearly cost Pamela her life, yet his downfall had catalyzed the very changes Helen had envisioned decades ago. Later that afternoon, Charles convened a meeting in the hospital's conference room. Community leaders, medical staff, and family members gathered to discuss the expanding healthcare initiative. The pilot program has exceeded all expectations Dr. Martinez presented. We're seeing decreased readmission rates, improved patient outcomes, and significantly higher satisfaction scores. Mrs. Sullivan, who had taken charge of the family support services, added her perspective. The integration of social services with medical care is making a real difference. Families feel supported beyond just treatment. The meeting was interrupted by sounds of laughter from the garden below. Pamela was leading a group of young patients in what appeared to be an impromptu dance party, their IV poles decorated with colorful streamers. Charles moved to the window, watching the scene with evident emotion. "This is what Helen saw possible," he said softly. "Healthcare that heals more than just physical ailments." The evening brought another milestone as the family gathered in Helen's garden for a private ceremony. The Helen Foster Memorial Research Center would officially open the following week, dedicated to continuing her work in patient-centered care. "Mother always said healing happens in layers," Natalie addressed the small gathering. "First the body, then the mind, then the spirit. What we're building here honors that wisdom." Rachel, who had once measured everything in terms of corporate success, now spoke of impact in more human terms. "We're not just treating patients," she observed. "We're healing families, rebuilding trust in healthcare, restoring hope." Albert stood before Helen's memorial bench, his bearing both humble and proud. "I made the wrong choice 25 years ago," he acknowledged. "But Helen's forgiveness, preserved in her journal, has shown us a better path." The garden had become more than a memorial, it was a symbol of transformation. Every flower, every peaceful corner reflected Helen's understanding that healing environments matter as much as medical treatments. As twilight settled over Chicago, the family lingered in the garden. Pamela dozed in Charles's arms while Natalie and Rachel discussed plans for expanding the community programs. Albert sat quietly, watching his family with profound gratitude. Mrs. Sullivan brought out coffee and Helen's favorite lemon cookies, maintaining traditions that bridged past and present. The simple gesture captured the essence of their journey. Healing happened not just in grand gestures, but in daily acts of care and remembrance. "Helen would be proud," Charles said softly to Natalie. "Not just of the changes we've made, but of the family we've become." The truth of his words settled over the garden like a blessing. They had faced crisis, confronted past mistakes, and emerged stronger. More importantly, they had discovered what Helen had known all along, that true healing begins with love, continues with forgiveness, and flourishes in unity. The federal courthouse stood imposing against the Chicago skyline as Christopher Williams faced justice. The prosecution's opening statement laid bare the full scope of his crimes, not just the recent attack on Pamela, but decades of fraud and manipulation. District Attorney Sarah Chen addressed the packed courtroom with measured precision. "The evidence will show that Mr. Williams orchestrated a systematic campaign of fraud, endangering patients and destroying careers to cover his own misconduct." In the gallery, Natalie sat between Charles and Rachel, her composure steady as Christopher's schemes were exposed. The documentation was overwhelming: altered records, falsified safety reports, and carefully hidden financial trails stretching back years. The defendant didn't just commit corporate fraud, Chen continued. He deliberately targeted vulnerable patients, including children, in his vendetta against the Whitmore family. His actions represent the worst abuse of medical trust. As witnesses took the stand, a pattern emerged that shocked even those familiar with the case. Former colleagues testified about Christopher's manipulation, how he had systematically isolated and discredited anyone who questioned his methods. Dr. Martinez's testimony proved particularly damaging. She presented meticulous evidence of how Christopher had altered hospital records, targeting not just Natalie but other healthcare professionals who threatened to expose him. He created an atmosphere of fear, Martinez explained. People were afraid to speak up, afraid to question procedures. When Dr. Foster discovered discrepancies in the pediatric budget, he moved to destroy her credibility before she could expose the truth. The most devastating testimony came from James Morrison himself, now seeking leniency through cooperation. The former business titan described how Christopher had manipulated his way onto Morrison Group's board with the sole purpose of accessing resources for his revenge. He presented himself as a healthcare expert who could help us compete with Whitmore Enterprises, Morrison testified. We didn't realize he was using our company to pursue a personal vendetta. During a court recess, Albert found Natalie in the courthouse garden. I should have seen through him years ago, he said quietly. When he first joined the hospital board, there were signs I chose to ignore. Natalie's response reflected Helen's Wisdom Mother's journal, talked about institutional blindness, how success can make us stop questioning, stop seeing what's right in front of us. The trial's most powerful moment came when Pamela's medical records were presented. The prosecution demonstrated how Christopher had specifically chosen cleaning products known to trigger her rare allergy, using information from the records he had altered years before. Charles's testimony detailed the corporate investigation that exposed the scheme. The attack on my granddaughter wasn't just criminal negligence, he stated firmly. It was a calculated act of revenge that could have cost an innocent child her life. Rachel's strategic expertise proved crucial in unraveling the financial aspects of Christopher's crimes. She traced complex money trails that revealed how he had profited from both the original hospital fraud and his position at Morrison Group. As the evidence mounted, Christopher's carefully maintained facade began to crack. His expression shifted from confident to desperate as former allies turned against him, revealing the true nature of his character. The defense attempted to paint Christopher as a whistleblower exposing corporate corruption, but the strategy fell apart under the weight of documentation from Helen's journal. Her detailed records, combined with Dr. Martinez's investigation, provided irrefutable proof of his guilt. On the trial's final day, before the jury retired to deliberate, Christopher requested to address the court. His statement revealed the depth of his bitterness. Everything I did was justified, he declared, his composure finally breaking. The Whitmore empire was built on secrets and lies. I just exposed the truth. Albert stood, addressing his former protégé with quiet authority. The truth, Christopher, is that you became what you claimed to fight against. You sacrificed ethics for revenge, patient safety for personal gain. The jury's deliberation was brief. The verdict, guilty on all counts, represented more than just legal justice. It validated the Whitmore family's transformation, their choice to embrace truth over appearance, healing over power. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as the family faced the media together. Natalie, speaking for them all, delivered a statement that captured their journey. Today isn't about victory or vindication. It's about acknowledging that true healing requires truth, however difficult that truth might be. Our family has learned this lesson through both triumph and tragedy. Moving forward, we remain committed to healthcare that puts patients first, guided by the wisdom of those who showed us a better way. The evening found them gathered in Helen's garden, where Pamela played safely among the flowers her grandmother had loved. The garden had become their sanctuary, a place where past and present merged in healing harmony. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Hospital Chapel as Caroline Whitmore, Rachel's mother, stepped inside for the first time in 25 years. Her return to Chicago, prompted by news of Pamela's illness and the family's transformation, marked another pivotal moment in their collective healing. Rachel stood frozen at the chapel entrance, emotion overwhelming her usual composure. Mother, the word carried decades of questions and longing. Caroline turned, her elegant bearing softened by evident emotion. I received your letters, she said softly. All of them. When I read about what happened to Pamela, about how the family came together, I knew it was time. Their reunion drew Albert from his morning hospital rounds. He stopped in the chapel doorway, the sight of his former wife rendering him momentarily speechless. Caroline met his gaze steadily, years of pain and understanding passing between them. "You finally chose love over appearances," she observed, her voice gentle. "Helen would be proud." In the pediatric ward, Natalie was conducting her morning examinations when Mrs. Sullivan arrived with the news of Caroline's return. The implications resonated deeply, another piece of their family's complex puzzle falling into place. Charles found them all in Helen's garden later that morning, where Caroline was meeting Pamela for the first time. The child's natural warmth broke through any remaining tension as she proudly showed her grandmother the flowers she helped tend. "I've been following your work from Paris," Caroline told Natalie. "The changes you've implemented in patient care, the community programs, it's everything Helen envisioned." The family gathered in the garden central pavilion, where Mrs. Sullivan had prepared a private lunch. The conversation flowed naturally, years of separation dissolving in the face of shared purpose and understanding. Caroline shared her own journey of healing, how distance had given her perspective on the family's dynamics. "I left because I couldn't bear watching Albert choose corporate success over human connection. Now I see that sometimes the longest path leads to the truest healing." Rachel, seated beside her mother, found herself sharing memories of childhood moments when Caroline's absence had felt most acute. The honesty was painful but necessary, part of the family's commitment to truth over comfortable silence. "I understood why you left," Rachel admitted. "I just didn't understand why you stayed away." Caroline's response reflected hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to recognize what matters most. Your father had to learn that lesson in his own time, in his own way." Albert, who had maintained a respectful distance, finally spoke. "I owe you both an apology," he said, addressing Caroline and Rachel. "I was so focused on building a legacy that I forgot the most important legacy is the love we share with family." The afternoon brought another surprise as Dr. Martinez arrived with Helen's complete medical research archives, discovered in a hospital storage facility. The detailed case studies and treatment protocols represented decades of careful observation and innovation. She never stopped working to improve patient care, Natalie realized, paging through her mother's notes. Even when she couldn't practice officially, she kept documenting, kept learning. Caroline examined the research with professional interest. Her own background in healthcare administration provided valuable insight into how Helen's methodologies could be implemented on a broader scale. "This is more than just medical research," she observed. "This is a blueprint for humanitarian healthcare, exactly what Albert and Helen originally envisioned together." The family spent hours reviewing Helen's work, each discovery deepening their appreciation for her foresight and dedication. Her influence had shaped them all, even those who had never met her directly. As evening approached, Caroline made an unexpected announcement. "I'm moving back to Chicago," she said simply. "If you'll have me, I'd like to help implement Helen's protocols across the hospital system." The offer represented more than professional expertise. It was an opportunity for complete family healing, for bridging old divides with new purpose. The Chicago Medical Association's annual conference center buzzed with anticipation as Natalie Foster took the stage to present the inaugural Helen Foster Healthcare Initiative. The audience included medical professionals from across the country, drawn by reports of revolutionary changes in patient care at Whitmore hospitals. 25 years ago, Natalie began. A dedicated nurse named Helen Foster documented her observations about patient care. Today, those insights have transformed our approach to healing. Her presentation detailed the remarkable outcomes since implementing Helen's protocols, reduced recovery times, improved patient satisfaction, and unprecedented success rates in complex cases. In the front row, Caroline and Rachel sat beside Albert, their professional expertise allowing them to appreciate the technical brilliance of Helen's work. The data spoke volumes. Patient outcomes had improved by 40% since implementing the integrated care model. Dr. Martinez followed with a comprehensive review of the research validation process. What makes these protocols revolutionary isn't just their medical effectiveness, she explained. It's their emphasis on treating the whole person, on recognizing that healing extends beyond physical symptoms. Charles, watching from the wings, noted how the medical community's initial skepticism had transformed into genuine enthusiasm. The presentation included case studies from Whitmore hospitals, each demonstrating the practical application of Helen's theories. The most compelling evidence came from the pediatric division's results. Natalie shared statistics that showed dramatically improved outcomes in cases previously considered challenging. By incorporating Helen's insights about environmental factors and emotional support, we've achieved breakthrough results in pediatric care. During the QA session, a prominent healthcare administrator asked about implementation costs. Rachel stepped forward to address the economic aspects, her corporate expertise complementing Natalie's medical knowledge. The initial investment in patient-centered care is offset by reduced readmission rates and improved recovery times, Rachel explained. Our data shows a 28% reduction in overall healthcare costs while improving outcomes. The conference marked more than just professional validation. It represented the full circle of Helen's vision. Her work, preserved through years of careful documentation, had finally found its moment to transform healthcare on a broader scale. Later that evening, the family gathered in the hospital's newly renovated family center. The space embodied Helen's principles about healing environments, combining medical expertise with comfortable, supportive surroundings. Caroline, whose healthcare administration experience had proved invaluable in implementing the new systems, shared observations about staff responses. The medical teams report increased job satisfaction. They feel empowered to truly help patients, not just treat symptoms. Albert watched Pamela playing with other young patients in the center's activity area. This is what Helen meant about healing communities, not just individuals, he reflected. Every aspect of care working together. The success of the Helen Foster initiative attracted attention from healthcare systems nationwide. Requests for training and implementation guidance poured in, leading to the establishment of a dedicated teaching program at Whitmore Medical Center. Charles, who had stepped back from direct corporate leadership to focus on healthcare advocacy, found himself increasingly involved in policy discussions at the national level. The Whitmore approach was becoming a model for healthcare reform. As the evening wound down, Natalie stood at the window overlooking Helen's garden, now replicated at hospitals across the city. Each garden served as both a healing space and a reminder of the wisdom that had guided their transformation. "Your mother would be incredibly proud," Caroline said softly, joining her stepdaughter. "Not just of the medical achievements, but of how her work has brought healing to our family as well." The truth of those words resonated through the gathering. Helen's legacy had indeed transcended medical protocols to touch every aspect of their lives, teaching them that true healing begins with love, grows through understanding, and flourishes in unity. The private dining room at the Whitmore mansion hosted its first complete family dinner in over 2 decades. Mrs. Sullivan had outdone herself, preparing favorites from both Caroline's and Helen's old recipe collections, a thoughtful gesture symbolizing the merging of past and present. Albert sat at the head of the table, a position that once represented corporate authority but now carried a different weight of responsibility. Caroline occupied the other end, her presence filling a void that had shaped their family dynamics for years. But "I found something today," Rachel announced, producing a dusty photo album. Mother's documentation of the hospital's early years before the merger. The photographs captured moments of profound significance: Albert and Helen collaborating on healthcare initiatives, Caroline organizing community outreach programs, the foundation of what would become their life's work. Natalie studied an image of her mother standing proudly in front of the original pediatric ward. She never lost sight of the fundamental purpose, she observed. Even when circumstances forced her away, she kept working toward better patient care. Charles, seated beside Natalie, recognized the same determination in her approach to rebuilding the healthcare division. "You've inherited that clarity of purpose," he noted quietly. "It's what drew me to stop that night in the rain." The conversation flowed naturally into discussing the future. Caroline shared insights from her years managing European healthcare systems, perspectives that complemented Helen's research perfectly. The integration of community support with medical care Helen saw its importance decades ago. Rachel, who had once viewed corporate success solely through profit metrics, now spoke passionately about expanding their community health initiatives. The data supports everything Mother believed about holistic healing approaches. Pamela's presence at the table added another dimension to their discussion. The child who had nearly become a casualty of old grievances now represented hope for the future. She moved easily between her grandparents, accepting love from all sides without the burden of past divisions. "I've been thinking," Albert said during a quiet moment, "about renaming the Whitmore Medical Center." He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. The Helen Foster Center for Integrated Healthcare. A proper recognition of her vision. The suggestion carried weight beyond simple recognition. It represented Albert's public acknowledgement of Helen's contribution, his willingness to finally place love above appearance. Caroline was the first to respond, her voice carrying years of understanding. "It's a fitting tribute, Albert. Not just to Helen, but to the principles she championed." As dinner progressed, Mrs. Sullivan noticed subtle but significant changes in how the family interacted. Old tensions had transformed into thoughtful consideration. Past hurts were acknowledged openly, but without bitterness, making space for new connections to form. Rachel and Natalie's sisterly bond continued to deepen, their different strengths creating a powerful synergy in both personal and professional spheres. "We should have had this all along," Rachel reflected, watching Natalie help Pamela with her dessert. Mother tried to tell Father that success without family isn't really success at all. Charles observed the family dynamics with quiet satisfaction, noting how his own role had evolved from corporate ally to something more fundamental. His connection with Natalie had grown naturally, rooted in mutual respect and shared values rather than crisis or obligation. Later, as they gathered in the garden Helen had inspired, Albert addressed them all. "We've spent years building walls," he admitted. "Corporate walls, emotional walls, walls of pride and fear. Helen's journal showed us a better way not just in healthcare but in life. The real healing begins when we have the courage to let those walls fall." The newly established Helen Foster Center for Integrated Healthcare hosted its first board meeting in the redesigned conference room, where Helen's portrait now held a place of honor. The agenda before them represented a bold departure from traditional corporate healthcare management. "Our patient satisfaction metrics have exceeded all projections," Rachel reported, presenting comprehensive data that tracked their progress since implementing Helen's protocols. More significantly, we're seeing measurable improvements in recovery rates and reduced readmissions. Caroline, drawing on her international healthcare experience, provided comparative analysis. The integrated care model is attracting attention from European medical centers. They're particularly interested in our family support programs. The professional dynamic between mother and daughter had evolved into a powerful partnership. Rachel's strategic acumen, combined with Caroline's administrative expertise, created innovative solutions to healthcare challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. Natalie presented the latest research outcomes from the pediatric division. By incorporating mothers' observations about environmental factors in healing, we've achieved breakthrough results in long-term recovery rates. Her presentation included case studies that demonstrated the practical impact of Helen's theories. Charles, who now focused on healthcare advocacy, shared updates on policy initiatives. State legislators are reviewing our model as a potential standard for hospital certification. The emphasis on holistic patient care has garnered bipartisan support. Albert, serving in an advisory capacity, watched with quiet pride as his family transformed the corporate legacy he'd built. The integration of Caroline's international experience, Rachel's business acumen, and Natalie's medical expertise created something far more valuable than his original vision. The afternoon session focused on expanding community outreach programs. Mrs. Sullivan, who had taken charge of the family support services, reported on their impact. "We're seeing entire families heal together," she noted, just as Helen predicted in her research. Dr. Martinez presented data from the research division, where Helen's methodologies were being validated through rigorous clinical studies. The scientific community initially questioned our approach, she acknowledged. The results have silenced the skeptics. The board meeting extended into early evening as they discussed implementation plans for satellite centers in underserved communities. Rachel and Caroline had identified locations where the integrated care model could have the most significant impact. Mother's Journal mentioned these same neighborhoods Natalie observed, reviewing the proposed sites. She saw the need for accessible healthcare decades ago. Outside the conference room, Pamela's laughter echoed through the halls as she visited with young patients in the children's ward. Her natural empathy and resilience had made her an unofficial ambassador for the center's family-focused approach. Charles found Natalie watching their interaction through the observation window. "She embodies everything we're trying to achieve here," he said softly. "Healing that extends beyond medical treatment to touch entire families." The day concluded with a private gathering in Helen's garden, where the family often retreated to reflect and reconnect. The professional success they'd achieved felt more meaningful because it grew from genuine collaboration rather than corporate mandate. Albert, observing his family's easy interaction, addressed them thoughtfully. "Helen understood something I took years to learn, that true success comes from nurturing relationships, not just managing resources." The evening light cast long shadows through the garden as they discussed future plans. Their professional achievements, impressive as they were, felt secondary to the deeper healing they'd found together. The Helen Foster Community Health Fair transformed the hospital grounds into a celebration of integrated healthcare. Families from across Chicago gathered beneath white tents, where medical professionals offered screenings, wellness education, and preventive care consultations. Caroline oversaw the main pavilion, where international healthcare experts presented innovative approaches to community medicine. Her years of experience in European healthcare systems had helped create a model that bridged cultural and economic divides. Helen's vision was always about accessibility, she explained to visiting administrators. Quality healthcare shouldn't be limited by social or economic barriers. Rachel coordinated with local business leaders, establishing partnerships that would sustain their community initiatives. Her corporate expertise now served a deeper purpose, creating sustainable programs that would outlast any single funding source. "The business community has embraced our integrated approach," she reported during the afternoon session. "They recognize that healthy communities create stronger economies." Natalie moved between medical stations, ensuring that Helen's protocols were properly implemented. Young medical students shadowed her, learning firsthand how to combine clinical excellence with genuine compassion. "Your mother's research changed how we think about patient care," one resident observed. "It's not just about treating symptoms anymore." The impact of their work became evident in individual stories. A grandmother described how the family support services had helped her grandson recover from serious illness. A single father tearfully thanked them for making specialized care accessible to his children. Charles, observing from the central garden, noted how naturally Pamela interacted with other children. She had become a living testament to their mission, demonstrating the resilience that comes from comprehensive support. Albert found himself drawn to the senior care pavilion, where elderly patients shared stories about Helen's early work at the hospital. Their memories painted a picture of a healer who saw beyond medical charts to the human needs beneath. "She never rushed," one elderly gentleman recalled. "Even when the ward was busy, she made time to really listen." Mrs. Sullivan coordinated the volunteer programs, which had grown to include former patients and their families. the cycle of healing and giving back strengthened community bonds in ways that transcended traditional healthcare boundaries. As evening approached, the family gathered for the dedication of a new wing focused on preventive care. The ceremony attracted community leaders, healthcare professionals, and families who had benefited from their programs. Today we celebrate more than medical advancement, Natalie addressed the crowd. We honor a vision of healthcare that recognizes the interconnectedness of all healing. Caroline and Rachel presented their expansion plans, detailing how the integrated care model would extend to underserved neighborhoods. Their presentation demonstrated how business acumen could serve humanitarian goals without compromising either. The day concluded with a candlelight ceremony in Helen's garden, where community members shared stories of transformation and hope. The garden had become more than a memorial, it was a symbol of their commitment to nurturing both physical and emotional healing. Charles found Natalie later that evening, as stars began appearing above the garden. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly, "not just of the medical advances, but of how her wisdom has brought healing to so many levels of our community." The morning sun cast a golden glow through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Chapel as Natalie adjusted her white medical coat. Today marked the official inauguration of the Helen Foster Medical Institute, a teaching facility dedicated to integrated healthcare principles. Charles stood beside her, reviewing his notes for the opening ceremony. The governor confirmed his attendance. He mentioned, "The state legislature is considering adopting our healthcare model as a standard." The transformation of Whitmore Enterprises into a leader in humanitarian healthcare had exceeded even their most optimistic projections. More importantly, it represented the fulfillment of both Helen's vision and Albert's original mission. Rachel entered, carrying the latest financial reports. Her tailored suit reflected her corporate expertise, but her demeanor had softened, balanced now by genuine human connection. "The endowment fund has surpassed our targets," she announced. "We can expand the scholarship program for medical students committed to community healthcare." Caroline joined them, bringing international perspective to their achievement. Her return to Chicago had bridged more than geographical distances, it had completed a circle of healing that extended far beyond their family. "The European Medical Council has approved our certification program," she reported. "Helen's protocols will be implemented across partner institutions in 12 countries." Albert arrived last, looking more peaceful than he had in decades. The weight of past choices had lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of seeing his family united in meaningful purpose. The board meeting just concluded, he shared, "Unanimous approval for the next phase of community clinics." Pamela's entrance with Mrs. Sullivan brought lightness to the formal gathering. Now 8 years old, she moved with the confidence of a child who had known only love and support, the living embodiment of their integrated care philosophy. Dr. Martinez arrived with the final statistics for their first 5 years of operation. Patient recovery rates have improved by 60%, she detailed. Long-term wellness indicators show unprecedented positive trends. The chapel filled gradually with hospital staff, community leaders, and families who had benefited from their programs. The gathering represented every aspect of their integrated approach to healing. Natalie stepped to the podium, her mother's journal resting beside her notes. 5 years ago, we discovered a blueprint for healthcare that puts humanity first, she began. Today, we're not just celebrating institutional success. We're honoring the wisdom that showed us how healing happens on multiple levels. She gestured to her family seated in the front row. We learned that true healing requires more than medical expertise. It needs the strategic vision to make care accessible, the administrative skill to make it sustainable, and most importantly, the compassion to make it meaningful. Charles watched her with quiet pride, remembering the desperate mother he'd encountered in the rain. Her journey from crisis to leadership had inspired similar transformations in countless others. Rachel and Caroline sat together, their restored relationship symbolizing the power of reconciliation. Their combined expertise had created systems that made quality healthcare available to all, regardless of circumstances. Albert listened intently, hearing echoes of Helen's wisdom in their achievements. His corporate legacy had evolved into something far more valuable than market success, a model for humanitarian healthcare that would benefit generations. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of Helen's portrait in the Institute's main hall. Her gentle smile seemed to approve of how her family had transformed personal healing into institutional change. Later, in Helen's garden, the family gathered privately to reflect on their journey. Pamela tended to her designated flower bed, unaware of how her near tragedy had catalyzed their transformation. Mother always said that crisis contains opportunity. Natalie observed, watching her daughter. She understood that healing happens in layers, starting with honest acknowledgement of wounds. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate hosted a gala celebrating 5 years of the Helen Foster Medical Institute. The event marked more than institutional success. It represented the complete transformation of a family once divided by corporate ambition. Albert Whitmore rose to address the distinguished gathering, his bearing reflecting both authority and humility. When we began this journey, we thought we were transforming healthcare. In truth, healthcare transformed us. Helen's vision showed us that healing begins with honesty and grows through unity. Caroline, elegant in midnight blue, sat beside Rachel at the family table. Their restored relationship had become a source of strength, combining Caroline's international healthcare expertise with Rachel's corporate acumen to create sustainable humanitarian programs. The European partnership exceeds our projections, Caroline reported during the formal presentation. 10 new integrated care centers will open across 3 continents next year, all following Helen's protocols. Rachel shared statistics that demonstrated their impact. Patient outcomes have improved by 70% in communities with our integrated care model. More importantly, we're seeing generational changes in how families approach healthcare. Charles, who had transitioned from corporate leadership to healthcare advocacy, presented their legislative achievements. State lawmakers have unanimously approved the Foster Whitmore healthcare standards. These guidelines ensure that integrated care becomes the norm, not the exception. Natalie's presentation focused on the human impact of their work. She shared stories of families healed, communities strengthened, and medical students inspired to pursue humanitarian healthcare. Mother believed that every patient deserves dignity, understanding, and comprehensive support. Today, that belief shapes medical education across the globe. Pamela, now carrying herself with the grace of early adolescence, participated in the ceremony by presenting scholarships to medical students committed to community healthcare. Her natural empathy and insight reflected the best qualities of both her mother and grandmother. Dr. Martinez received special recognition for her role in validating Helen's research. The medical community once questioned these methods, she acknowledged. Now they're studying them as the future of healthcare. Mrs. Sullivan, who had become Director of Family Support Services, reported on the community impact. We're seeing second-generation success stories. Children who benefited from our programs are now bringing their own families to our centers. The evening included the announcement of major initiatives, new research facilities, expanded community programs, and international teaching partnerships. Each development built upon Helen's foundation while pushing boundaries she had only dreamed possible. Albert found himself watching his family with profound gratitude. Rachel and Caroline collaborated seamlessly on presentation details, their past estrangement replaced by deep understanding. Natalie moved confidently between medical colleagues, her authority grounded in both expertise and compassion. Charles stood beside Natalie as they greeted guests, their partnership exemplifying how personal and professional bonds could strengthen each other. Their relationship had grown naturally from mutual respect and shared values, becoming a cornerstone of their integrated approach to healing. The gala concluded with a candlelight ceremony in Helen's garden, where community members shared stories of transformation. The garden, once a symbol of hidden truth, had become a testament to the power of honesty and reconciliation. As stars appeared above the gathering, Albert addressed his family privately. Helen knew that true legacy isn't built on corporate success alone. It grows from love, understanding, and the courage to choose what matters most, together. We've created something far more valuable than I ever imagined possible. The 10th anniversary of the Helen Foster Medical Institute dawned with promise as the Whitmore family gathered for a private ceremony before the day's public celebrations. In the tranquil morning light of Helen's garden, they reflected on their remarkable journey. Dr. Natalie Foster Green, now internationally recognized for revolutionizing patient care, stood beside her husband Charles as they watched Pamela lead a group of young patients through the garden's therapeutic programs. Their daughter had grown into a poised teenager who embodied Helen's compassionate spirit and the family's commitment to healing. Today we celebrate more than institutional success, Natalie addressed her gathered family. We honor a transformation that began with one woman's vision and grew through our collective courage to choose truth over appearance, love over ambition. Rachel and Caroline had collaborated to establish the Whitmore Foundation for Global Healthcare, extending Helen's integrated care model to developing nations. Their mother-daughter partnership had become a powerful force for positive change, proving that reconciliation could yield extraordinary results. The foundation has established 50 integrated care centers across 3 continents, Rachel reported, sharing the latest data. Each facility implements Helen's protocols while respecting local cultural practices. The results consistently exceed expectations. Albert Whitmore, now in his serene later years, watched his family with quiet joy. The corporate titan, who once prioritized profit over personal connection, had discovered a deeper form of success through their shared mission of healing. Helen understood something I took too long to learn, he reflected. True legacy isn't measured in market shares or profit margins. It's measured in lives touched, families strengthened, and communities transformed. The institute itself had become a global center for medical education, attracting students committed to humanitarian healthcare. Dr. Martinez, serving as Director of Research, had developed a comprehensive curriculum that combined Helen's insights with cutting-edge medical science. Our graduates don't just become skilled physicians, Martinez explained. They become healers who understand that medical care is only one component of overall wellness. The evening's public celebration showcased the far-reaching impact of their work. Community leaders shared stories of neighborhoods revitalized through accessible healthcare. International partners reported on successful implementations of the Foster-Whitmore model across diverse cultural contexts. Mrs. Sullivan, who had mentored countless family support coordinators, presented data on generational impact. We're seeing children who benefited from our early programs now bringing their own families to our centers. The cycle of healing continues. Charles, whose advocacy had helped make integrated healthcare a national standard, announced ambitious new initiatives. Today we launch the next phase of our mission. The Helen Foster Global Health Initiative will ensure that quality healthcare becomes accessible to every community, regardless of economic status. As twilight settled over the garden, Pamela unveiled a new installation, a series of healing gardens designed by young patients, each reflecting their personal journeys of recovery. The project exemplified their commitment to involving patients in their own healing process. Caroline, whose return had completed their family circle, addressed the gathering a decade ago. We discovered that institutional healing begins with personal truth. Helen's wisdom showed us that when we have the courage to face our own wounds, we gain the strength to heal others. The family's journey had transformed not just healthcare but their understanding of success itself. Through their united efforts, they had created something far more valuable than corporate achievement, a legacy of healing that would benefit generations to come. As stars appeared above Helen's garden, Natalie shared a final reflection. Mother believed that every person deserves not just medical care, but understanding, dignity, and support. Through our work together, we've proven that her vision wasn't just idealistic, it was transformative. The evening concluded with the announcement of the Helen Foster Memorial Scholarship, ensuring that future generations of healthcare professionals would carry forward their integrated approach to healing. The scholarship, like Helen's legacy, represented the perfect fusion of professional excellence and humanitarian purpose. Looking out over the gathered community, the Whitmore family stood united not just by blood or marriage, but by shared commitment to a vision larger than themselves. They had discovered that true healing begins with honesty, grows through unity, and flourishes when love guides every decision. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility, as they continued the work Helen had begun, transforming healthcare one life, one family, one community at a time. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful story of family healing and transformation. What resonated most with you? Was it the journey from crisis to redemption, the power of truth to heal old wounds, or perhaps the triumph of compassion over corporate ambition? Share your perspective in the comments below, and let's discuss how choosing love over appearances can transform not just families, but entire communities. Join our growing community of thoughtful viewers who appreciate meaningful stories that touch the heart and inspire positive change. Subscribe to our channel and activate notifications to be part of this journey of discovery. Every day, we bring you carefully selected narratives that remind us of our shared humanity and the power of forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with others who might need its message of hope and healing. Your share could inspire someone facing similar challenges or remind them that it's never too late for reconciliation. Together, we can create a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. Follow Healing Hearts Family Redemption for more inspiring stories of transformation. Remember, every story shared is a light that might guide someone else toward healing. What moments in your own life have taught you about the power of forgiveness and family bonds? Let's continue this meaningful conversation below.